Book 1, Book 1st, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 1, The Charybdis of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and the Scylla of the Faubourg du Temple. The two most memorable barricades which the observer of social maladies can name do not belong to the period in which the action of this work is laid. These two barricades, both of them symbols under two different aspects of a redoubtable situation, sprang from the earth at the time of the fatal insurrection of June 1848, the greatest war of the streets that history has ever beheld. It sometimes happens that even contrary to principles, even contrary to liberty, equality, and fraternity, even contrary to the universal vote, even contrary to the government by all for all, from the depths of its anguish, of its discouragements and its destitutions, of its fevers, of its distresses, of its miasmas, of its ignorances, of its darkness, that great and despairing body, the rabble protests against, and that the populace wages battle against, the people. Beggars attack the common right. The ochlocracy rises against demos. These are melancholy days, for there is always a certain amount of night, even in this madness. There is suicide in this duel, and those words which are intended to be insults, beggars, canaille, ochlocracy, populace, exhibit, alas, rather the fault of those who reign than the fault of those who suffer, rather the fault of the privileged than the fault of the disinherited. For our own part, we never pronounce these words without pain and without respect. For when philosophy fathoms the facts to which they correspond, it often finds many a grandeur beside these miseries. Athens was an ochlocracy. The beggars were the making of Holland. The populace saved Rome more than once, and the rabble followed Jesus Christ. There is no thinker who has not at times contemplated the magnificences of the lower classes. It was of this rabble that St. Jerome was thinking, no doubt, and of all these poor people and all these vagabonds and all these miserable people whence sprang the apostles and the martyrs when he uttered this mysterious saying, Fex urbis, lex orbis, the dregs of the city, the law of the earth. The exasperations of this crowd which suffers and bleeds, its violences contrary to all sense, directed against the principles which are its life, its masterful deeds against the right, are its popular coup d'etat and should be repressed. The man of probity sacrifices himself, and out of his very love for this crowd he combats it. But how excusable he feels it even while holding out against it, how he venerates it even while resisting it. This is one of those rare moments when, while doing that which it is one's duty to do, one feels something which disconcerts one and which would dissuade one from proceeding further. One persists, it is necessary, but conscience, though satisfied, is sad, and the accomplishment of duty is complicated with a pain at the heart. June 1848, let us hasten to say, was an exceptional fact, and almost impossible of classification in the philosophy of history. All the words which we have just uttered must be discarded when it becomes a question of this extraordinary revolt, in which one feels the holy anxiety of toil claiming its rights. It was necessary to combat it, and this was a duty, for it attacked the Republic. But what was June 1848 at bottom? A revolt of the people against itself. Where the subject is not lost sight of, there is no digression. May we then be permitted to arrest the reader's attention for a moment on the two absolutely unique barricades of which we have just spoken and which characterize this insurrection. One blocked the entrance to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The other defended the approach to the Faubourg du Temple. those before whom these two fearful masterpieces of civil war reared themselves beneath the brilliant blue sky of June will never forget them. The Saint-Antoine barricade was tremendous. It was 3 stories high and 700 feet wide. It barred the vast opening of the Faubourg, that is to say 3 streets from angle to angle. Ravined, jagged, cut up, divided, crenellated, with an immense rent, buttressed with piles that were bastions in themselves, throwing out capes here and there, powerfully backed up by 2 great promontories of houses of the Faubourg. It reared itself like a cyclopean dike at the end of the formidable place which had seen the 14th of July. 19 barricades were ranged, one behind the other, in the depths of the streets behind this principal barricade. At the very sight of it, one felt the agonizing suffering in the immense Faubourg, which had reached that point of extremity when a distress may become a catastrophe. Of what was that barricade made? Of the ruins of 3 6-story houses demolished expressly, said some. Of the prodigy of all wraths, said others. It wore the lamentable aspect of all constructions of hatred, ruin. It might be asked, who built this? It might also be said, who destroyed this? It was the improvisation of ebullition. Hold! Take this door, this grating, this penthouse, this chimney-piece, this broken brazier, this cracked pot. Give all, cast away all. Push this roll, dig, dismantle, overturn, ruin everything. It was the collaboration of the pavement, the block of stone, the beam, the bar of iron, the rag, the scrap, the broken pane, the unseated chair, the cabbage stalk, the tatter, the rag, and the malediction. It was grand and it was petty. It was the abyss parodied on the public place by hubbub. The mass beside the atom, the strip of ruined wall and the broken bowl, threatening fraternization of every sort of rubbish. Sisyphus had thrown his rock there, and Job his potsherd. Terrible, in short. It was the Acropolis of the barefooted. Overturned carts broke the uniformity of the slope. An immense dray was spread out there crossways, its axle pointed heavenward, and seemed a scar on that tumultuous facade. An omnibus hoisted gaily by main force to the very summit of the heap, as though the architects of this bit of savagery had wished to add a touch of the street urchin humor to their terror, presented its horseless, unharnessed pole to no one knows what horses of the air. This gigantic heap, the alluvium of the revolt, figured to the mind an ossa on Pelion of all revolutions. 93 on 89, the 9th of Thermidor on the 10th of August, the 18th of Brumaire on the 11th of January, Vendemiaire on Prairial, 1848 on 1830. The situation deserved the trouble, and this barricade was worthy to figure on the very spot whence the Bastille had disappeared. If the ocean made dikes, it is thus that it would build. The fury of the flood was stamped on this shapeless mass. What flood? The crowd. One thought one beheld hubbub petrified. One thought one heard humming above this barricade as though there had been over their hive enormous dark bees of violent progress. Was it a thicket? Was it a bacchanalia? Was it a fortress? Vertigo seemed to have constructed it with blows of its wings. There was something of the cesspool in that redoubt, and something Olympian in that confusion. One there beheld, in a pell-mell full of despair, the rafters of roofs, bits of garret windows with their figured paper, window sashes with their glass planted there in the ruins awaiting the cannon, wrecks of chimneys, cupboards, tables, benches, howling topsy-turvydom, and those thousands poverty-stricken things, the very refuse of the mendicant, which contain at the same time fury and nothingness. One would have said that it was the tatters of a people, rags of wood, of iron, of bronze, of stone, and that the Faubourg Saint-Antoine had thrust it there at its door with a colossal flourish of the broom making of its misery its barricade. Blocks resembling headsman's blocks, dislocated chains, pieces of woodwork with brackets having the form of gibbets, horizontal wheels projecting from the rubbish, amalgamated with this edifice of anarchy the somber figure of the old tortures endured by the people. The barricade Saint-Antoine converted everything into a weapon. Everything that civil war could throw at the head of society proceeded thence. It was not combat, it was a paroxysm. The carbines which defended this redoubt, among which there were some blunderbusses, sent bits of earthenware bones, coat buttons, even the casters from nightstands, dangerous projectiles on account of the brass. This barricade was furious. It hurled to the clouds an inexpressible clamor at certain moments when, provoking the army, it was covered with throngs and tempests. A tumultuous crowd of flaming heads crowned it. A swarm filled it. It had a thorny crest of guns, of sabers, of cudgels, of axes, of pikes, and of bayonets. A vast red flag flapped in the wind. Shouts of command, songs of attack, the rolls of drums, the sobs of women, and bursts of gloomy laughter from the starving were to be heard there. It was huge and living, and like the back of an electric beast, there proceeded from it little flashes of lightning. The spirit of revolution covered with its cloud this summit, where rumbled that voice of the people which resembles the voice of God. A strange majesty was emitted by this titanic basket of rubbish. It was a heap of filth, and it was Sinai. As we have said previously, it attacked in the name of the revolution. What? The revolution, that barricade. Chance, hazard, disorder, terror, misunderstanding, the unknown. It had facing it the Constituent Assembly, the sovereignty of the people, universal suffrage, the nation, the republic, and it was the Carmagnole bidding defiance to the Marseillaise. Immense but heroic defiance, for the old Faubourg is a hero. The Faubourg and its redoubt lent each other assistance. The Faubourg shouldered the redoubt. The redoubt took its stand under cover of the Faubourg. The vast barricade spread out like a cliff against which the strategy of the African generals dashed itself. Its caverns, its excrescences, its warts, its gibbosities grimaced, so to speak, and grinned beneath the smoke. The mitraille vanished in shapelessness. The bombs plunged into it. Bullets only succeeded in making holes in it. What was the use of cannonading chaos? And the regiments, accustomed to the fiercest visions of war, gazed with uneasy eyes on that species of redoubt, a wild beast in its boar-like bristling, and a mountain by its enormous size. A quarter of a league away, from the corner of the Rue du Temple, which debouches on the boulevard near the Château d'Eau, if one thrust one's head bodily beyond the point formed by the front of the d'Allemagne shop, one perceived in the distance, beyond the canal, in the street which mounts the slopes of Belleville, at the culminating point of the rise, a strange wall reaching to the second story of the house fronts, a sort of hyphen between the houses on the right and the houses on the left, as though the street had folded back on itself its loftiest wall in order to close itself abruptly. This wall was built of paving stones. It was straight, correct, cold, perpendicular, leveled with the square, laid out by rule and line. Cement was lacking, of course, but as in the case of certain Roman walls, without interfering with its rigid architecture. The entablature was mathematically parallel with the base. From distance to distance, one could distinguish on the gray surface almost invisible loopholes, which resembled black threads. These loopholes were separated from each other by equal spaces. The street was deserted as far as the eye could reach. All windows and doors were closed. In the background rose this barrier which made a blind thoroughfare of the street, a motionless and tranquil wall. No one was visible, nothing was audible, not a cry, not a sound, not a breath, a sepulchre. The dazzling sun of June inundated this terrible thing with light. It was the barricade of the Faubourg of the Temple. As soon as one arrived on the spot and caught sight of it, it was impossible, even for the boldest, not to become thoughtful before this mysterious apparition. It was adjusted, jointed, imbricated, rectilinear, symmetrical, and funereal. Science and gloom met there. One felt that the chief of this barricade was a geometrician or a specter. One looked at it and spoke low. From time to time, if some soldier, an officer or representative of the people chanced to traverse the deserted highway, a faint sharp whistle was heard, and the passer-by fell dead or wounded, or, if he escaped the bullet, sometimes a Biscayan was seen to ensconce itself in some closed shutter in the interstice between two blocks of stone, or in the plaster of a wall. For the men in the barricade had made themselves two small cannons out of two cast-iron lengths of gas pipe, plugged up at one end with tow and fire clay, and there was no waste of useless powder. Nearly every shot told. There were corpses here and there, and pools of blood on the pavement. I remember a white butterfly which went and came in the street. Summer does not abdicate. In the neighborhood, the spaces beneath the porte cochère were encumbered with wounded. One felt oneself aimed at by some person whom one did not see, and one understood that guns were leveled at the whole length of the street. Massed behind the sort of sloping ridge which the vaulted canal forms at the entrance to the Faubourg du Temple, the soldiers of the attacking column gravely and thoughtfully watched this dismal redoubt, this immobility, this passivity whence sprang death. Some crawled flat on their faces as far as the crest of the curve of the bridge, taking care that their shakos did not project beyond it. The valiant Colonel Montenard admired this barricade with a shudder. "How that is built," he said to a representative. "Not one paving stone projects beyond its neighbor. It is made of porcelain." At that moment, a bullet broke the cross on his breast, and he fell. "The cowards," people said. "Let them show themselves. Let us see them. They dare not. They are hiding." The barricade of the Faubourg du Temple, defended by 80 men, attacked by 10,000, held out for 3 days. On the 4th, they did as at Zacha, as at Constantine. They pierced the houses, they came over the roofs, the barricade was taken. Not one of the 80 cowards thought of flight. All were killed there, with the exception of the leader, Barthélemy, of whom we shall speak presently. The Saint-Antoine barricade was the tumult of thunders. The barricade of the Temple was silence. The difference between these two redoubts was the difference between the formidable and the sinister. One seemed a maw, the other a mask. Admitting that the gigantic and gloomy insurrection of June was composed of a wrath and of an enigma, one divined in the first barricade the dragon, and behind the second the Sphinx. These two fortresses had been erected by two men named, the one Cournet, the other Barthélemy. Cournet made the Saint-Antoine barricade, Barthélemy the barricade of the Temple. Each was the image of the man who had built it. Cournet was a man of lofty stature. He had broad shoulders, a red face, a crushing fist, a bold heart, a loyal soul, a sincere and terrible eye. Intrepid, energetic, irascible, stormy, the most cordial of men, the most formidable of combatants. War, strife, conflict were the very air he breathed, and put him in a good humor. He had been an officer in the Navy, and from his gestures and his voice one divined that he sprang from the ocean, and that he came from the tempest. He carried the hurricane on into battle. With the exception of the genius, there was in Cournet something of Danton, as with the exception of the divinity, there was in Danton something of Hercules. Barthélemy, thin, feeble, pale, taciturn, was a sort of tragic street urchin who, having had his ears boxed by a policeman, lay in wait for him and killed him, and at 17 was sent to the galleys. He came out and made this barricade. Later on, fatal circumstance in London proscribed by all, Barthélemy slew Cournet. It was a funereal duel. Some time afterwards, caught in the gearing of one of those mysterious adventures in which passion plays a part, a catastrophe in which French justice sees extenuating circumstances, and in which English justice sees only death, Barthélemy was hanged. The somber social construction is so made that, thanks to material destitution, thanks to moral obscurity, that unhappy being who possessed an intelligence certainly firm, possibly great, began in France with the galleys and ended in England with the gallows. Barthélemy, on occasion, flew one flag, the black flag. End of Book 1, Chapter 1. Book the First, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 2. What is to be done in the abyss if one does not converse? 16 years count in the subterranean education of insurrection, and June 1848 knew a great deal more about it than June 1832. So the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie was only an outline, and an embryo compared to the two colossal barricades which we have just sketched, but it was formidable for that epoch. The insurgents, under the eye of Enjolras, for Marius no longer looked after anything, had made good use of the night. The barricade had been not only repaired, but augmented. They had raised it 2 feet. Bars of iron planted in the pavement resembled lances in rest. All sorts of rubbish brought and added from all directions complicated the external confusion. The redoubt had been cleverly made over into a wall on the inside and a thicket on the outside. The staircase of paving stones, which permitted one to mount it like the wall of a citadel, had been reconstructed. The barricade had been put in order, the tap room disencumbered, the kitchen appropriated for the ambulance, the dressing of the wounded completed, the powder scattered on the ground and on the tables had been gathered up, bullets run, cartridges manufactured, lint scraped, the fallen weapons redistributed, the interior of the redoubt cleaned, the rubbish swept up, corpses removed. They laid the dead in a heap in the Mondétour lane, of which they were still the masters. The pavement was red for a long time at that spot. Among the dead there were 4 National Guardsmen of the suburbs. Enjolras had their uniforms laid aside. Enjolras had advised 2 hours of sleep. Advice from Enjolras was a command. Still, only 3 or 4 took advantage of it. Feuilly employed those 2 hours in engraving this inscription on the wall which faced the tavern: "Long live the peoples." These 4 words, hollowed out in the rough stone with a nail, could be still read on the wall in 1848. The 3 women had profited by the respite of the night to vanish definitely, which allowed the insurgents to breathe more freely. They had found means of taking refuge in some neighboring house. The greater part of the wounded were able and wished to fight still. On a litter of mattresses and trusses of straw in the kitchen, which had been converted into an ambulance, there were 5 men gravely wounded, 2 of whom were municipal guardsmen. The municipal guardsmen were attended to first. In the tap room there remained only Mabeuf under his black cloth and Javert bound to his post. "This is the hall of the dead," said Enjolras. In the interior of this hall, barely lighted by a candle at one end, the mortuary table being behind the post like a horizontal bar, a sort of vast, vague cross resulted from Javert erect and Mabeuf lying prone. The pole of the omnibus, although snapped off by the fusillade, was still sufficiently upright to admit of their fastening the flag to it. Enjolras, who possessed that quality of a leader of always doing what he said, attached to this staff the bullet-ridden and the bloody coat of the old man's. No repast had been possible. There was neither bread nor meat. The 50 men in the barricade had speedily exhausted the scanty provisions of the wine shop during the 16 hours which they had passed there. At a given moment, every barricade inevitably becomes the raft of the Méduse. They were obliged to resign themselves to hunger. They had then reached the first hours of that Spartan day of the 6th of June, when in the barricade Saint-Merry, Jeanne, surrounded by the insurgents who demanded bread, replied to all combatants, crying, "Something to eat?" with, "Why? It is 3 o'clock. At 4 o'clock we shall be dead." As they could no longer eat, Enjolras forbade them to drink. He interdicted wine and portioned out the brandy. They had found in the cellar 15 full bottles hermetically sealed. Enjolras and Combeferre examined them. Combeferre, when he came up again, said, "It's the old stock of Father Hucheloup, who began business as a grocer." "It must be real wine," observed Bossuet. "It's lucky that Grantaire is asleep. If he were on foot, there would be a good deal of difficulty in saving these bottles." Enjolras, in spite of all murmurs, placed his veto on the 15 bottles, and in order that no one might touch them, he had them placed under the table on which Father Mabeuf was lying. About 2 o'clock in the morning, they reckoned up their strength. There were still 37 of them. The day began to dawn. The torch, which had been replaced in its cavity in the pavement, had just been extinguished. The interior of the barricade, that species of tiny courtyard appropriated from the street, was bathed in shadows, and resembled, athwart the vague twilight horror, the deck of a disabled ship. The combatants, as they went and came, moved about there like black forms. Above that terrible nesting place of doom and gloom, the stories of the mute houses were lividly outlined. At the very top, the chimney stood palely out. The sky was of that charming, undecided hue which may be white and may be blue. Birds flew about in it with cries of joy. The lofty house which formed the back of the barricade, being turned to the east, had upon its roof a rosy reflection. The morning breeze ruffled the gray hair on the head of the dead man at the third-story window. "I am delighted that the torch has been extinguished," said Courfeyrac to Feuilly. "That torch flickering in the wind annoyed me. It had the appearance of being afraid. The light of torches resembles the wisdom of cowards. It gives a bad light because it trembles." Dawn awakens minds as it does the birds. All began to talk. Joly, perceiving a cat prowling on a gutter, extracted philosophy from it. "What is the cat?" he exclaimed. "It is a corrective. The good God, having made the mouse, said, 'Hello, I have committed a blunder,' and so he made the cat. The cat is the erratum of the mouse. The mouse plus the cat is the proof of creation revised and corrected." Combeferre, surrounded by students and artisans, was speaking of the dead, of Jean Prouvaire, of Bahorel, of Mabeuf, and even of Cabuc, and of Enjolras' sad severity. He said, Harmodius and Aristogiton, Brutus, Chereas, Stephanus, Cromwell, Charlotte Corday, Sand have all had their moment of agony when it was too late. Our hearts quiver so, and human life is such a mystery that even in the case of a civic murder, even in a murder for liberation, if there be such a thing, the remorse for having struck a man surpasses the joy of having served the human race. And such are the windings of the exchange of speech, that a moment later, by a transition brought about through Jean Prouvaire's verses, Combeferre was comparing the translators of the Georgics, Rau with Cournant, Cournant with Delille, pointing out the passages translated by Malfilâtre, particularly the prodigies of Caesar's death, and at that word, Caesar, the conversation reverted to Brutus. Caesar, said Combeferre, fell justly. Cicero was severe toward Caesar, and he was right. That severity is not diatribe. When Zoilus insults Homer, when Maevius insults Virgil, when Vyse insults Molière, when Pope insults Shakespeare, when Frederick insults Voltaire, it is an old law of envy and hatred which is being carried out. Genius attracts insult. Great men are always more or less barked at. But Zoilus and Cicero are two different persons. Cicero is an arbiter in thought, just as Brutus is an arbiter by the sword. For my part, I blame that last justice, the blade. But antiquity admitted it. Caesar, the violator of the Rubicon, conferring as though they came from him, the dignities which emanated from the people, not rising at the entrance of the Senate, committed the acts of a king and almost of a tyrant, regia ac pene tyrannica. He was a great man, so much the worse, or so much the better. The lesson is but the more exalted. His 23 wounds touch me less than the spitting in the face of Jesus Christ. Caesar is stabbed by the senators. Christ is cuffed by lackeys. One feels the God through the greater outrage. Bossuet, who towered above the interlocutors from the summit of a heap of paving stones, exclaimed, rifle in hand, O Sidethinium! O Myrrhinus! O Probalinthus! O graces of the Iantides! Oh, who will grant me to pronounce the verses of Homer like a Greek of Laurium or of Adeption? Chapter 3. Light and Shadow. Enjolras had been to make a reconnaissance. He had made his way out through Mondétour Lane, gliding along close to the houses. The insurgents, we will remark, were full of hope. The manner in which they had repulsed the attack of the preceding night had caused them to almost disdain in advance the attack at dawn. They waited for it with a smile. They had no more doubt as to their success than as to their cause. Moreover, succor was evidently on the way to them. They reckoned on it. With that facility of triumphant prophecy which is one of the sources of strength in the French combatant, they divided the day which was at hand into 3 distinct phases. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a regiment which had been labored with, quote unquote, would turn. At noon, the insurrection of all Paris. At sunset, revolution. They heard the alarm bell of Saint-Méry, which had not been silent for an instant since the night before, a proof that the other barricade, the great one, Jeanne's, still held out. All these hopes were exchanged between the different groups in a sort of gay and formidable whisper, which resembled the warlike hum of a hive of bees. Enjolras reappeared. He returned from his somber eagle flight into outer darkness. He listened for a moment to all this joy with folded arms and one hand on his mouth. Then, fresh and rosy in the growing whiteness of the dawn, he said, "The whole army of Paris is to strike. A third of the army is bearing down upon the barricades in which you now are. There is the National Guard in addition. I have picked out the shakos of the 5th of the line and the standard bearers of the 6th Legion. In 1 hour you will be attacked. As for the populace, it was seething yesterday. Today it is not stirring. There is nothing to expect, nothing to hope for, neither from a faubourg nor from a regiment. You are abandoned." These words fell upon the buzzing of the groups and produced on them the effect caused on a swarm of bees by the first drops of a storm. A moment of indescribable silence ensued, in which death might have been heard flitting by. This moment was brief. A voice from the obscurest depths of the groups shouted to Enjolras, "So be it! Let us raise the barricade to a height of 20 feet, and let us all remain in it. Citizens, let us offer the protests of corpses. Let us show that if the people abandon the Republicans do not abandon the people." These words freed the thought of all from the painful cloud of individual anxieties. It was hailed with an enthusiastic acclamation. No one ever has known the name of the man who spoke thus. He was some unknown blouse wearer, a stranger, a man forgotten, a passing hero, that great anonymous, always mingled in human crises and in social geniuses, who, at a given moment, utters in a supreme fashion the decisive word, and who vanishes into the shadows after having represented for a minute in a lightning flash the people and God. This inexorable resolution so thoroughly impregnated the air of the 6th of June, 1832, that almost at the very same hour, on the barricade Saint-Merry, the insurgents were raising that clamor which has become a matter of history and which has been consigned to the documents in the case. Quote unquote, "What matters it whether they come to our assistance or not? Let us get ourselves killed here to the very last man." As the reader sees, the two barricades, though materially isolated, were in communication with each other. End of Book 1, Chapters 2 and 3. Book First, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 4, -5 + 1. After the man who decreed the quote-unquote protest of corpses had spoken and had given this formula of their common soul, there issued from all mouths a strangely satisfied and terrible cry, funereal in a sense and triumphant in tone. "Long live death! Let us all remain here." "Why all?" said Enjolras. "All, all!" Enjolras resumed. "The position is good, the barricade is fine, 30 men are enough, why sacrifice 40? They replied, "Because not one will go away." "Citizens," cried Enjolras, and there was an almost irritated vibration in his voice, "this republic is not rich enough in men to indulge in useless expenditure of them. Vainglory is waste. If the duty of some is to depart, that duty should be fulfilled like any other." Enjolras, the man principal, had over his co-religionists that sort of omnipotent power which emanates from the absolute. Still, great as was this omnipotence, a murmur arose. A leader to the very fingertips, Enjolras, seeing that they murmured, insisted. He resumed haughtily, "Let those who are afraid of not numbering more than 30 say so." The murmurs redoubled. "Besides," observed a voice in one group, "it is easy enough to talk about leaving. The barricade is hemmed in." "Not on the side of Les Halles," said Enjolras. "The Rue Mondétour is free. and through the Rue des Prêcheurs one can reach the Marche des Innocents. And there, went on another voice, you would be captured. You would fall in with some grand guard of the line or the suburbs. They will spy a man passing in blouse and cape. Whence come you? Don't you belong to the barricade? And they will look at your hands. You smell of powder, shot. Enjolras, without making any reply, touched Combeferre's shoulder, and the two entered the tap-room. They emerged thence a moment later. Enjolras held in his outstretched hands the 4 uniforms which he had laid aside. Combeferre followed, carrying the shoulder belts and the shakoes. With this uniform, said Enjolras, you can mingle with the ranks and escape. Here is enough for 4. And he flung on the ground, deprived of its pavement, the 4 uniforms. No wavering took place in his stoical audience. Combeferre took the word. Come, said he, you must have a little pity. Do you know what the question is here? It is a question of women. See here. Are there women or are there not? Are there children or are there not? Are there mothers, yes or no, who rock cradles with their foot and who have a lot of little ones around them? Let that man of you who has never beheld a nurse's breast raise his hand. Ah, you want to get yourselves killed? So do I who am speaking to you. But I do not want to feel the phantoms of women wreathing their arms around me. Die if you will, but don't make others die. Suicides like that which is on the brink of accomplishment here are sublime, but suicide is narrow and does not admit of extension, and as soon as it touches your neighbors, suicide is murder. Think of the little blonde heads, think of the white locks. Listen, Enjolras has just told me that he saw at the corner of the Rue du Cygne a lighted casement, a candle in a poor window on the 5th floor, and on the pane the quivering shadow of the head of an old woman who had the air of having spent the night in watching. Perhaps she is the mother of some one of you. Well, let that man go and make haste to say to his mother, here I am, mother. Let him feel at ease. The task here will be performed all the same. When one supports one's relatives by one's toil, one has not the right to sacrifice oneself. That is deserting one's family. And those who have daughters, what are you thinking of? You get yourselves killed, you are dead, that is well. And tomorrow? Young girls without bread, that is a terrible thing. Man begs, women sells. Ah, those charming and gracious beings, so gracious and so sweet, who have bonnets of flowers, who fill the house with purity, who sing and prattle, who are like a living perfume, who prove the existence of angels in heaven by the purity of virgins on earth. That Jeanne, that Lise, that Mimi, those adorable and honest creatures who are your blessings and your pride, ah, good God, they will suffer hunger. What do you want me to say to you? There is a market for human flesh, and it is not with your shadowy hands shuddering around them that you will prevent them from entering it. Think of the street. Think of the pavement covered with passers-by. Think of the shops past which women go and come with necks all bare and through the mire. These women, too, were pure once. Think of your sisters, those of you who have them. Misery, prostitution, the police, Saint-Lazare. That is what those beautiful, delicate girls, those fragile marvels of modesty, gentleness, and loveliness, fresher than lilacs in the month of May, will come to. Ah, you have got yourselves killed. You are no longer on hand. That is well. You have wished to release the people from royalty, and you deliver over your daughters to the police. Friends, have a care, have mercy. Women, unhappy women, we are not in the habit of bestowing much thought on them. We trust to the women not having received a man's education. We prevent their reading. We prevent their thinking. We prevent their occupying themselves with politics. Will you prevent them from going to the dead house this evening and recognizing your bodies? Let us see. Those who have families must be tractable, and shake hands with us and take themselves off, and leave us here alone to tend to this affair. I know well that courage is required to leave, that it is hard. But the harder it is, the more meritorious. You say, I have a gun. I am at the barricade. So much the worse. I shall remain there. So much the worse is easily said. My friends, there is a morrow. You will not be here tomorrow, but your families will. And what sufferings! See, here is a pretty, healthy child, with cheeks like an apple, who babbles, prattles, chatters, who laughs, who smells sweet beneath your kiss. And do you know what becomes of him when he is abandoned? I have seen one, a very small creature, no taller than that. His father was dead. Poor people had taken him in out of charity, but they had bread only for themselves. The child was always hungry. It was winter. He did not cry. You could see him approach the stove, in which there was never any fire, and whose pipe, you know, was of mastic and yellow clay. His breathing was hoarse, his face livid, his limbs flaccid, his belly prominent. He said nothing. If you spoke to him, he did not answer. He is dead. He was taken to the Necker hospital, where I saw him. I was house surgeon in that hospital. Now, if there are any fathers among you, fathers whose happiness it is to stroll on Sundays holding their child's tiny hand in their robust hand, let each one of those fathers imagine that this child is his own. That poor brat I remember, and I seem to see him now when he lay nude on the dissecting table, how his ribs stood out on his skin like the graves beneath the grass in a cemetery. A sort of mud was found in his stomach. There were ashes in his teeth. Come, let us examine ourselves conscientiously and take counsel with our heart. Statistics show that the mortality among abandoned children is 55%. I repeat, it is a question of women. It concerns mothers, it concerns young girls, it concerns little children. Who is talking to you of yourselves? We know well what you are. We know well that you are all brave, parbleu. We know well that you all have in your souls the joy and the glory of giving your life for the great cause. We know well that you feel yourselves elected to die usefully and magnificently, and that each one of you clings to his share in the triumph. Very well, but you are not alone in this world. There are other beings of whom you must think. You must not be egoists. All dropped their heads with a gloomy air. Strange contradictions of the human heart at its most sublime moments. Combeferre, who spoke thus, was not an orphan. He recalled the mothers of other men and forgot his own. He was about to get himself killed. He was an egoist. Marius, fasting, fevered, having emerged in succession from all hope, and having been stranded in grief, the most somber of shipwrecks, and saturated with violent emotions and conscious that the end was near, had plunged deeper and deeper into that visionary stupor which always precedes the fatal hour voluntarily accepted. A physiologist might have studied in him the growing symptoms of that febrile absorption known to and classified by science, and which is to suffering what voluptuousness is to pleasure. Despair also has its ecstasy. Marius had reached this point. He looked on at everything as from without. As we have said, things which passed before him seemed far away. He made out the whole, but did not perceive the details. He beheld men going and coming as through a flame. He heard voices speaking as at the bottom of an abyss. But this moved him. There was in this scene a point which pierced and roused even him. He had but one idea now, to die, and he did not wish to be turned aside from it, but he reflected, in his gloomy somnambulism, that while destroying himself, he was not prohibited from saving someone else. He raised his voice. Enjolras and Combeferre are right, he said. No unnecessary sacrifice. I join them, and you must make haste. Combeferre has said convincing things to you. There are some among you who have families, mothers, sisters, wives, children. Let such leave the ranks. No one stirred. Married men and the supporters of families step out of the ranks, repeated Marius. His authority was great. Enjolras was certainly the head of the barricade, but Marius was its savior. I order it, cried Enjolras. I entreat you, said Marius. Then, touched by Combeferre's words, shaken by Enjolras' order, touched by Marius's entreaty, these heroic men began to denounce each other. It is true, said one man to a full-grown man, you are the father of a family. Go. It is your duty, rather, retorted the man. You have 2 sisters whom you maintain. And an unprecedented controversy broke forth. Each struggled to determine which should not allow himself to be placed at the door of the tomb. Make haste, said Courfeyrac. In another quarter of an hour it will be too late. Citizens, pursued Enjolras, this is the Republic, and universal suffrage reigns. Do you yourselves designate those who are to go? They obeyed. After the expiration of a few minutes, 5 were unanimously selected and stepped out of the ranks. There are 5 of them, exclaimed Marius. There were only 4 uniforms. Well, began the 5, one must stay behind. And then a struggle arose as to who should remain and who should find reasons for the others not remaining. The generous quarrel began afresh. You have a wife who loves you. You have your aged mother. You have neither father nor mother, and what is to become of your 3 little brothers? You are the father of 5 children. You have a right to live. You are only 17. It is too early for you to die. These great revolutionary barricades were assembling points for heroism. The improbable was simple there. These men did not astonish each other. Be quick, repeated Courfeyrac. Men shouted to Marius from the groups, do you designate who is to remain? Yes, said the 5, choose, we will obey you. Marius did not believe that he was capable of another emotion. Still, at this idea, that of choosing a man for death, his blood rushed back to his heart. He would have turned pale had it been possible for him to become any paler. He advanced towards the 5, who smiled upon him, each with his eyes full of that grand flame which one beholds in the depths of history hovering over Thermopylae, cried to him, me, me, me. And Marius stupidly counted them. There were still 5 of them. Then his glance dropped to the 4 uniforms. At that moment, a 5th uniform fell, as if from heaven, upon the other 4. The 5th man was saved. Marius raised his eyes and recognized Monsieur Fauchelevent. Jean Valjean had just entered the barricade. He had arrived by way of Mondétour lane, whither by dint of inquiries made, or by instinct, or by chance. Thanks to his dress of a National Guardsman, he had made his way without difficulty. The sentinel stationed by the insurgents in the Rue Mondétour had no occasion to give the alarm for a single National Guardsman, and he had allowed the latter to entangle himself in the street, saying to himself, probably it is a reinforcement. In any case, it is a prisoner. The moment was too grave to admit of the sentinel abandoning his duty and his post of observation. At the moment when Jean Valjean entered the redoubt, no one had noticed him, all eyes being fixed on the 5 chosen men and the 4 uniforms. Jean Valjean also had seen and heard, and he had silently removed his coat and flung it on the pile with the rest. The emotion aroused was indescribable. "Who is this man?" demanded Bossuet. "He is a man who saves others," replied Combeferre. Marius added in a grave voice, "I know him." This guarantee satisfied every one. Enjolras turned to Jean Valjean. "Welcome, citizen." And he added, "You know that we are about to die." Jean Valjean, without replying, helped the insurgent whom he was saving to don his uniform. End of Book 1, Chapter 4. Book the First. The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 5. The Horizon Which One Beholds from the Summit of a Barricade. The situation of all in that fatal hour and that pitiless place had as result and culminating point Enjolras' supreme melancholy. Enjolras bore within him the plenitude of the revolution. He was incomplete, however, so far as the absolute can be so. He had too much of Saint-Just about him and not enough of Anacharsis Clootz. Still, his mind, in the society of the friends of the ABC, had ended by undergoing a certain polarization from Combeferre's ideas. For some time past, he had been gradually emerging from the narrow form of dogma, and had allowed himself to incline to the broadening influence of progress, and he had come to accept as a definitive and magnificent evolution the transformation of the great French Republic into the immense human republic. As far as the immediate means were concerned, a violent situation being given, he wished to be violent. On that point he never varied. And he remained of that epic and redoubtable school which is summed up in the words 83. Enjolras was standing erect on the staircase of paving stones, one elbow resting on the stock of his gun. He was engaged in thought. He quivered as at the passage of prophetic breaths. Places where death is have these effects of tripods. A sort of stifled fire darted from his eyes, which were filled with an inward look. All at once he threw back his head. His blonde locks fell back like those of an angel on the somber quadriga made of stars. They were like the mane of a startled lion in the flaming of an halo, and Enjolras cried, "Citizens, do you picture the future to yourselves? The streets of cities inundated with light, green branches on the thresholds, nations sisters, men just, old men blessing children, the past loving the present, thinkers entirely at liberty, believers on terms of full equality, for religion, heaven, God the direct priest, human conscience become an altar, no more hatreds, the fraternity of the workshop and the school, for soul penalty and recompense fame, work for all, right for all, peace over all, no more bloodshed, no more wars, happy mothers. To conquer matter is the first step. To realize the ideal is the second. Reflect on what progress has already accomplished. Formerly, the first human races beheld with terror the hydra pass before their eyes, breathing on the waters, the dragon which vomited flame, the griffin who was the monster of the air, and who flew with the wings of an eagle and the talons of a tiger. Fearful beasts which were above man. Man, nevertheless, spread his snares, consecrated by intelligence, and finally conquered these monsters. We have vanquished the hydra, and it is called the locomotive. We are on the point of vanquishing the griffin. We already grasp it, and it is called the balloon. On the day when this Promethean task shall be accomplished, and when man shall have definitely harnessed to his will the triple chimera of antiquity, the hydra, the dragon, and the griffin, he will be the master of water, fire, and of air. He will be for the rest of animated creation that which the ancient gods formerly were to him. Courage and onward! Citizens, whither are we going? To science-made government, to the force of things become the sole public force, to the natural law having in itself its sanction and its penalty and promulgating itself by evidence, to a dawn of truth corresponding to a dawn of day. We are advancing to the union of peoples. We are advancing to the unity of man. No more fictions, no more parasites. The real governed by the true. That is the goal. Civilization will hold its assizes at the summit of Europe, and later on at the center of continents, in a grand parliament of the intelligence. Something similar has already been seen. The Amphictyons had 2 sittings a year, one at Delphos, the seat of the gods, and the other at Thermopylae, the place of heroes. Europe will have her Amphictyons. The globe will have its Infections. France bears this sublime future in her breast. This is the gestation of the 19th century. That which Greece sketched out is worthy of being finished by France. Listen to me, you, Feuilly, valiant artisan, man of the Republic. I revere you. Yes, you clearly behold the future. Yes, you are right. You had neither father nor mother. Feuilly, you adopted humanity for your mother and right for your father. You are about to die, that is to say, to triumph here. Citizens, whatever happens today through our defeat as well as through our victory, it is a revolution that we are about to create. As conflagrations light up a whole city, so revolutions illuminate the whole human race. And what is the revolution that we shall cause? We have just told you, the revolution of the true. From a political point of view, there is but a single principle, the sovereignty of man over himself. This sovereignty of myself over myself is called liberty. Where 2 or 3 of these sovereignties are combined, the state begins. But in that association there is no abdication. Each sovereignty concedes a certain quantity of itself for the purpose of forming the common right. This quantity is the same for all of us. This identity of concession which each makes to all is called equality. Common right is nothing else than the protection of all beaming on the right of each. This protection of all over each is called fraternity. The point of intersection of all these assembled sovereignties is called society. This intersection being a junction, this point is a knot. Hence what is called the social bond. Some say social contract, which is the same thing, the word contract being etymologically formed with the idea of a bond. Let us come to an understanding about equality, for if liberty is the summit, equality is the base. Equality, citizens, is not wholly a surface vegetation, a society of great blades of grass and tiny oaks, a proximity of jealousies which render each other null and void. Legally speaking, it is all aptitudes possessed of the same opportunity. Politically, it is all votes possessed of the same weight. Religiously, it is all consciences possessed of the same right. Equality has an organ, gratuitous and obligatory instruction. The right to the alphabet, that is where the beginning must be made. The primary school imposed on all, the secondary school offered to all, that is the law. From an identical school, an identical society will spring. Yes, instruction, light, everything comes from light, and to it everything returns. Citizens, the 19th century is great, but the 20th century will be happy. Then there will be nothing more like the history of old. We shall no longer, as today, have to fear a conquest, an invasion, an usurpation, a rivalry of nations, arms in hand, an interruption of civilization depending on a marriage of kings, on a birth in hereditary tyrannies, a partition of peoples by a congress, a dismemberment because of the failure of a dynasty, a combat of two religions meeting face to face like two bucks in the dark on the bridge of the infinite. We shall no longer have to fear famine, farming out, prostitution arising from distress, misery from the failure of work, and the scaffold and the sword and battles and the ruffianism of chance in the forest of events. One might almost say there will be no more events. We shall be happy. The human race will accomplish its law as the terrestrial globe accomplishes its law. Harmony will be reestablished between the soul and the star. The soul will gravitate around the truth as the planet around the light. Friends, the present hour in which I am addressing you is a gloomy hour. But these are terrible purchases of the future. A revolution is a toll. Oh, the human race will be delivered, raised up, consoled. We affirm it on this barrier. Whence should proceed that cry of love, if not from the heights of sacrifice? Oh, my brothers, this is the point of junction, of those who think and of those who suffer. This barricade is not made of paving stones, nor of joists, nor of bits of iron. It is made of two heaps, a heap of ideas and a heap of woes. Here, misery meets the ideal. The day embraces the night and says to it, I am about to die, and thou shalt be born again with me. From the embrace of all desolations, faith leaps forth. Sufferings bring hither their agony, and ideas their immortality. This agony and this immortality are about to join and constitute our death. Brothers, he who dies here dies in the radiance of the future, and we are entering a tomb all flooded with the dawn. Enjolras paused rather than became silent. His lips continued to move silently as though he were talking to himself, which caused them all to gaze attentively at him in the endeavor to hear more. There was no applause, but they whispered together for a long time. Speech being a breath, the rustling of intelligences resembles the rustling of leaves. Chapter 6. Marius haggard, Javert laconic. Let us narrate what was passing in Marius's thoughts. Let the reader recall the state of his soul. We have just recalled it. Everything was a vision to him now. His judgment was disturbed. Marius, let us insist on this point, was under the shadow of the great dark wings which are spread over those in the death agony. He felt that he had entered the tomb. It seemed to him that he was already on the other side of the wall, and he no longer beheld the faces of the living except with the eyes of one dead. How did Monsieur Fauchelevent come there? Why was he there? What had he come there to do? Marius did not address all these questions to himself. Besides, since our despair has this peculiarity that it envelops others as well as ourselves, it seemed logical to him that all the world should come thither to die. Only, he thought of Cosette with a pang at his heart. However, Monsieur Fauchelevent did not speak to him, did not look at him, and had not even the air of hearing him, when Marius raised his voice to say, I know him. As far as Marius was concerned, this attitude of Monsieur Fauchelevent was comforting, and if such a word can be used for such impressions, we should say that it pleased him. He had always felt the absolute impossibility of addressing that enigmatical man who was, in his eyes, both equivocal and imposing. Moreover, it had been a long time since he had seen him, and this still further augmented the impossibility for Marius's timid and reserved nature. The 5 chosen men left the barricade by way of Mondétour Lane. They bore a perfect resemblance to members of the National Guard. One of them wept as he took his leave. Before setting out, they embraced those who remained. When the 5 men sent back to life had taken their departure, Enjolras thought of the man who had been condemned to death. He entered the tap-room. Javert, still bound to the post, was engaged in meditation. "Do you want anything?" Enjolras asked him. Javert replied, "When are you going to kill me?" "Wait. We need all our cartridges just at present." "Then give me a drink," said Javert. Enjolras himself offered him a glass of water, and as Javert was pinioned, he helped him to drink. "Is that all?" inquired Enjolras. "I am uncomfortable against this post," replied Javert. "You are not tender to have left me to pass the night here. Bind me as you please, but you surely might lay me out on a table like that other man." And with a motion of the head he indicated the body of Monsieur Mabeuf. There was, as the reader will remember, a long, broad table at the end of the room on which they had been running bullets and making cartridges. All the cartridges having been made and all the powder used, this table was free. At Enjolras' command, 4 insurgents unbound Javert from the post. While they were loosing him, a 5th held a bayonet against his breast. Leaving his arms tied behind his back, they placed about his feet a slender but stout whipcord, as is done to men on the point of mounting the scaffold, which allowed him to take steps about 15 inches in length and made him walk to the table at the end of the room, where they laid him down, closely bound about the middle of the body. By way of further security and by means of a rope fastened to his neck, they added to the system of ligatures which rendered every attempt at escape impossible, that sort of bond which is called in prisons a martingale, which, starting at the neck, forks on the stomach and meets the hands after passing between the legs. While they were binding Javert, a man standing on the threshold was surveying him with singular attention. The shadow cast by this man made Javert turn his head. He raised his eyes and recognized Jean Valjean. He did not even start, but dropped his lids proudly and confined himself to the remark, "It is perfectly simple." End of Book 1, Chapters 5 and 6. Book the First, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 7, The Situation Becomes Aggravated. The daylight was increasing rapidly. Not a window was opened, not a door stood ajar. It was the dawn, but not the awaking. The end of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, opposite the barricade, had been evacuated by the troops, as we have stated it seemed to be free, and presented itself to passers-by with a sinister tranquillity. The Rue Saint-Denis was as dumb as the avenue of the Sphinx at Thebes. Not a living being in the crossroads, which gleamed white in the light of the sun. Nothing is so mournful as this light in deserted streets. Nothing was to be seen, but there was something to be heard. A mysterious movement was going on at a certain distance. It was evident that the critical moment was approaching. As on the previous evening, the sentinels had come in, but this time all had come. The barricade was stronger than on the occasion of the first attack. Since the departure of the 5, they had increased its height still further. On the advice of the sentinel, who had examined the region of Les Halles, Enjolras, for fear of a surprise in the rear, came to a serious decision. He had the small gut of the Mondétour lane, which had been left open up to that time, barricaded. For this purpose they tore up the pavement for the length of several houses more. In this manner, the barricade, walled on 3 streets, in front on the Rue de la Chanvrerie, to the left on the Rue du Cygne and de la Petite Truanderie, and to the right on the Rue Mondétour, was really almost impregnable. It is true that they were fatally hemmed in there. It had 3 fronts, but no exit. "A fortress, but a rat-hole too," said Courfeyrac with a laugh. Enjolras had about 30 paving stones torn up in excess, said Bossuet, piled up near the door of the wine shop. The silence was now so profound in the quarter whence the attack must needs come, that Enjolras had each man resume his post of battle. An allowance of brandy was doled out to each. Nothing is more curious than a barricade preparing for an assault. Each man selects his place as though at the theater. They jostle and elbow and crowd each other. There are some who make stalls of paving stones. Here is a corner of the wall which is in the way, it is removed. Here is a redan which may afford protection, they take shelter behind it. Left-handed men are precious, they take the places that are inconvenient to the rest. Many arrange to fight in a sitting posture. They wish to be at ease to kill and to die comfortably. In the sad war of June 1848, an insurgent who was a formidable marksman and who was firing from the top of a terrace upon a roof had a reclining chair brought there for his use. A charge of grape shot found him out there. As soon as the leader has given the order to clear the decks for action, all disorderly movements cease. There is no more pulling from one another, there are no more coteries, no more asides, there is no more holding aloof. Everything in their spirits converges in and changes into a waiting for the assailants. A barricade before the arrival of danger is chaos. In danger, it is discipline itself. Peril produces order. As soon as Enjolras had seized his double-barreled rifle and had placed himself in a sort of embrasure which he had reserved for himself, all the rest held their peace. A series of faint, sharp noises resounded confusedly along the wall of paving stones. It was the men cocking their guns. Moreover, their attitudes were prouder, more confident than ever. The excess of sacrifice strengthens. They no longer cherished any hope, but they had despair, the last weapon which sometimes gives victory. Virgil has said so. Supreme resources spring from extreme resolutions. To embark in death is sometimes the means of escaping a shipwreck, and the lid of the coffin becomes a plank of safety. As on the preceding evening, the attention of all was directed, we might almost say leaned upon, the end of the street, now lighted up and visible. They had not long to wait. A stir began distinctly in the Saint-Leu quarter, but it did not resemble the movement of the first attack. A clashing of chains, the uneasy jolting of a mass, the click of brass skipping along the pavement, a sort of solemn uproar announced that some sinister construction of iron was approaching. There arose a tremor in the bosoms of these peaceful old streets, pierced and built for the fertile circulation of interests and ideas, and which are not made for the horrible rumble of the wheels of war. The fixity of eye in all the combatants upon the extremity of the street became ferocious. A cannon made its appearance. Artillerymen were pushing the piece. It was in firing trim. The fore-carriage had been detached. 2 upheld the gun carriage, 4 were at the wheels, others followed with the caisson. They could see the smoke of the burning lintstock. "Fire!" shouted Enjolras. The whole barricade fired. The report was terrible. An avalanche of smoke covered and effaced both cannon and men. After a few seconds, the cloud dispersed, and the cannon and men reappeared. The gun crew had just finished rolling it slowly, correctly, without haste, into position facing the barricade. Not one of them had been struck. Then the captain of the piece, bearing down upon the breach in order to raise the muzzle, began to point the cannon with the gravity of an astronomer leveling a telescope. "Bravo for the cannoneers!" cried Bossuet, and the whole barricade clapped their hands. A moment later, squarely planted in the very middle of the street, astride of the gutter, the piece was ready for action. A formidable pair of jaws yawned on the barricade. "Come merrily now," ejaculated Courfeyrac. "That's the brutal part of it. After the fillip on the nose, the blow from the fist. The army is reaching out its big paw to us. The barricade is going to be severely shaken up. The fusillade tries, the cannon takes." "It is a piece of 8, new model, brass," added Combeferre. "Those pieces are liable to burst as soon as the proportion of 10 parts of tin to 100 of brass is exceeded. The excess of tin renders them too tender. Then it comes to pass that they have caves and chambers when looked at from the vent hole. In order to obviate this danger and to render it possible to force the charge, it may become necessary to return to the process of the 14th century, hooping, and to encircle the piece on the outside with a series of unwelded steel bands from the breech to the trunnions. In the meantime, they remedy this defect as best they may. They manage to discover where the holes are located in the vent of a cannon by means of a searcher. But there is a better method, with Gribeauval's movable star. In the 16th century, remarked Bossuet, they used to rifle cannon. "Yes," replied Combeferre, "that augments the projectile force, but diminishes the accuracy of the firing. In firing at short range, the trajectory is not as rigid as could be desired. The parabola is exaggerated. The line of the projectile is no longer sufficiently rectilinear to allow of its striking intervening objects, which is, nevertheless, a necessity of battle, the importance of which increases with the proximity of the enemy and the precipitation of the discharge. This defect of the tension of the curve of the projectile in the rifled cannon of the 16th century arose from the smallness of the charge. Small charges for that sort of engine are imposed by the ballistic necessities, such, for instance, as the preservation of the gun carriage. In short, that despot, the cannon, cannot do all that it desires. Force is a great weakness. A cannon ball only travels 600 leagues an hour. Light travels 70,000 leagues a second. Such is the superiority of Jesus Christ over Napoleon. "Reload your guns," said Enjolras. How was the casing of the barricade going to behave under the cannonballs? Would they effect a breach? That was the question. While the insurgents were reloading their guns, the artillerymen were loading the cannon. The anxiety in the redoubt was profound. The shot sped, the report burst forth. "Present!" shouted a joyous voice, and Gavroche flung himself into the barricade just as the ball dashed against it. He came from the direction of the Rue du Cygne, and he had nimbly climbed over the auxiliary barricade which fronted on the labyrinth of the Rue de la Petite Truanderie. Gavroche produced a greater sensation in the barricade than the cannonball. The ball buried itself in the mass of rubbish. At the most, there was an omnibus wheel broken, and the old Anceau cart was demolished. On seeing this, the barricade burst into a laugh. "Go on!" shouted Bossuet to the artillerists. Chapter 8. The artillerymen compel people to take them seriously. They flocked around Gavroche, but he had no time to tell anything. Marius drew him aside with a shudder. "What are you doing here?" "Hello," said the child. "What are you doing here yourself?" And he stared at Marius intently with his epic effrontery. His eyes grew larger with the proud light within them. It was with an accent of severity that Marius continued. "Who told you to come back? Did you deliver my letter at the address?" Gavroche was not without some compunctions in the matter of that letter. In his haste to return to the barricade, he had got rid of it rather than delivered it. He was forced to acknowledge to himself that he had confided it rather lightly to that stranger whose face he had not been able to make out. It is true that the man was bareheaded, but that was not sufficient. In short, he had been administering to himself little inward remonstrances, and he feared Marius's reproaches. In order to extricate himself from the predicament, he took the simplest course. He lied abominably. "Citizen, I delivered the letter to the porter. The lady was asleep. She will have the letter when she wakes up." Marius had had two objects in sending that letter: to bid farewell to Cosette and to save Gavroche. He was obliged to content himself with the half of his desire. The dispatch of his letter and the presence of Monsieur Fauchelevent in the barricade was a coincidence which occurred to him. He pointed out Monsieur Fauchelevent to Gavroche. "Do you know that man?" "No," said Gavroche. Gavroche had, in fact, as we have just mentioned, seen Jean Valjean only at night. The troubled and unhealthy conjectures which had outlined themselves in Marius's mind were dissipated. Did he know Monsieur Fauchelevent's opinions? Perhaps Monsieur Fauchelevent was a Republican. Hence his very natural presence in this combat. In the meanwhile, Gavroche was shouting at the other end of the barricade, "My gun!" Courfeyrac had it returned to him. Gavroche warned his comrades, as he called them, that the barricade was blocked. He had had great difficulty in reaching it. A battalion of the line, whose arms were piled in the Rue de la Petite Truanderie, was on the watch on the side of the Rue du Cygne. On the opposite side, the municipal guard occupied the Rue des Prêcheurs. The bulk of the army was facing them in front. This information given, Gavroche added, "I authorize you to hit him a tremendous whack." Meanwhile, Enjolras was straining his ears and watching at his embrasure. The assailants, dissatisfied no doubt with their shot, had not repeated it. A company of infantry of the line had come up and occupied the end of the street behind the piece of ordnance. The soldiers were tearing up the pavement and constructing with the stones a small, low wall, a sort of side work not more than 18 inches high, and facing the barricade. In the angle at the left of this épaulement there was visible the head of the column of a battalion from the suburbs, massed in the Rue Saint-Denis. Enjolras, on the watch, thought he distinguished the peculiar sound which is produced when the shells of grape shot are drawn from the caissons, and he saw the commander of the piece change the elevation and incline the mouth of the cannon slightly to the left. Then the cannoneers began to load the piece. The chief seized the lintstock himself and lowered it to the vent. "Down with your heads, hug the wall," shouted Enjolras, "and all on your knees along the barricade." The insurgents, who were straggling in front of the wine shop and who had quitted their posts of combat on Gavroche's arrival, rushed pell-mell towards the barricade. But before Enjolras' order could be executed, the discharge took place with the terrifying rattle of a round of grape shot. This is what it was, in fact. The charge had been aimed at the cut in the redoubt and had there rebounded from the wall, and this terrible rebound had produced 2 dead and 3 wounded. If this were continued, the barricade was no longer tenable. The grape shot made its way in. A murmur of consternation arose. "Let us prevent the second discharge," said Enjolras, and lowering his rifle, he took aim at the captain of the gun, who at that moment was bearing down on the breech of his gun and rectifying and definitely fixing its pointing. The captain of the piece was a handsome sergeant of artillery, very young, blond, with a very gentle face, and the intelligent air peculiar to that predestined and redoubtable weapon which, by dint of perfecting itself in horror, must end in killing war. Combeferre, who was standing beside Enjolras, scrutinized this young man. "What a pity," said Combeferre. "What hideous things these butcheries are. Come, when there are no more kings, there will be no more war. Enjolras, you are taking aim at that sergeant. You are not looking at him. Fancy, he is a charming young man. He is intrepid. It is evident that he is thoughtful. Those young artillerymen are very well educated. He has a father, a mother, a family. He's probably in love. He's not more than 25 at the most. He might be your brother." "He is," said Enjolras. "Yes," replied Combeferre, "he is mine too. Well, let us not kill him. Let me alone, it must be done." And a tear trickled slowly down Enjolras' marble cheek. At the same moment he pressed the trigger of his rifle. The flame leaped forth. The artilleryman turned around twice, his arms extended in front of him, his head uplifted as though for breath. Then he fell with his side on the gun and lay there motionless. They could see his back, from the center of which there flowed directly a stream of blood. The ball had transversed his breast from side to side. He was dead. He had to be carried away and replaced by another. Several minutes were thus gained, in fact. End of Book 1, Chapters 7 and 8. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapters 9 through 11. Chapter 9. Employment of the old talents of a poacher and that infallible marksmanship which influenced the condemnation of 1796. Opinions were exchanged in the barricade. The firing from the gun was about to begin again. Against that grape shot they could not hold out a quarter of an hour longer. It was absolutely necessary to deaden the blows. Enjolras issued this command: "We must place a mattress there." "We have none," said Combeferre. "The wounded are lying on them." Jean Valjean, who was seated apart on a stone post at the corner of the tavern with his gun between his knees, had, up to that moment, taken no part in anything that was going on. He did not appear to hear the combatants saying around him, "Here is a gun that is doing nothing." At the order issued by Enjolras, he rose. It will be remembered that on the arrival of the rabble in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, an old woman, foreseeing the bullets, had placed her mattress in front of her window. This window, an attic window, was on the roof of a 6-story house situated a little beyond the barricade. The mattress, placed crosswise, supported at the bottom on 2 poles for drying linen, was upheld at the top by 2 ropes, which, at that distance, looked like 2 threads, and which were attached to 2 nails planted in the window frames. These ropes were distinctly visible, like hairs against the sky. "Can someone lend me a double-barreled rifle?" said Jean Valjean. Enjolras, who had just reloaded his, handed it to him. Jean Valjean took aim at the attic window and fired. One of the mattress ropes was cut. The mattress now hung by 1 thread only. Jean Valjean fired the second charge. The second rope lashed the panes of the attic window. The mattress slipped between the two poles and fell into the street. The barricade applauded. All voices cried, "Here is a mattress!" "Yes," said Combeferre, "but who will go and fetch it?" The mattress had, in fact, fallen outside the barricade between besiegers and besieged. Now, the death of the sergeant of artillery having exasperated the troop, the soldiers had for several minutes been lying flat on their stomachs behind the line of paving stones which they had erected, and in order to supply the forced silence of the piece, which was quiet while its service was in course of reorganization, they had opened fire on the barricade. The insurgents did not reply to this musketry in order to spare their ammunition. The fusillade broke against the barricade, but the street which it filled was terrible. Jean Valjean stepped out of the cut, entered the street, traversed the storm of bullets, walked up to the mattress, hoisted it upon his back, and returned to the barricade. He placed the mattress in the cut with his own hands. He fixed it there against the wall in such a manner that the artillerymen should not see it. That done, they awaited the next discharge of grape shot. It was not long in coming. The cannon vomited forth its package of buckshot with a roar. But there was no rebound. The effect which they had foreseen had been attained. The barricade was saved. "Citizen," said Enjolras to Jean Valjean, "the Republic thanks you." Bossuet admired and laughed. He exclaimed, "It is immoral that a mattress should have so much power. Triumph of that which yields over that which strikes with lightning. But never mind, glory to the mattress which annuls a cannon." End of Book 1, Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Dawn. At that moment, Cosette awoke. Her chamber was narrow, neat, unobtrusive, with a long sash window facing the east on the back courtyard of the house. Cosette knew nothing of what was going on in Paris. She had not been there on the preceding evening, and she had already retired to her chamber when Toussaint had said, "It appears that there is a row." Cosette had slept only a few hours, but soundly. She had had sweet dreams, which possibly arose from the fact that her little bed was very white. Someone, who was Marius, had appeared to her in the light. She awoke with the sun in her eyes, which at first produced on her the effect of being a continuation of her dream. Her first thought on emerging from this dream was a smiling one. Cosette felt herself thoroughly reassured. Like Jean Valjean, she had, a few hours previously, passed through that reaction of the soul which absolutely will not hear of unhappiness. She began to cherish hope with all her might, without knowing why. Then she felt a pang at her heart. It was 3 days since she had seen Marius, but she said to herself that he must have received her letter, that he knew where she was, and that he was so clever that he would find means of reaching her, and that certainly today, and perhaps that very morning. It was broad daylight, but the rays of light were very horizontal. She thought that it was very early, but that she must rise nevertheless in order to receive Marius. She felt that she could not live without Marius, and that consequently that was sufficient, and that Marius would come. No objection was valid. All this was certain. It was monstrous enough already to have suffered for 3 days. Marius absent 3 days. This was horrible on the part of the good God. Now this cruel teasing from on high had been gone through with. Marius was about to arrive, and he would bring good news. Youth is made thus. It quickly dries its eyes. It finds sorrow useless and does not accept it. Youth is the smile of the future in the presence of an unknown quantity, which is itself. It is natural to it to be happy. It seems as though its respiration were made of hope. Moreover, Cosette could not remember what Marius had said to her on the subject of this absence which was to last only one day, and what explanation of it he had given her. Every one has noticed with what nimbleness a coin which one has dropped on the ground rolls away and hides, and with what art it renders itself undiscoverable. There are thoughts which play us the same trick. They nestle away in a corner of our brain. That is the end of them. They are lost. It is impossible to lay the memory on them. Cosette was somewhat vexed at the useless little effort made by her memory. She told herself that it was very naughty and very wicked of her to have forgotten the words uttered by Marius. She sprang out of bed and accomplished the 2 ablutions of soul and body, her prayers and her toilette. One may, in any case of exigency, introduce the reader into a nuptial chamber, not into a virginal chamber. Verse would hardly venture it, prose must not. It is the interior of a flower that is not yet unfolded. It is whiteness in the dark. It is the private cell of a closed lily, which must not be gazed upon by man so long as the sun has not gazed upon it. Woman in the bud is sacred. That innocent bud which opens, that adorable half-nudity which is afraid of itself, that white foot which takes refuge in a slipper, that throat which veils itself before a mirror as though a mirror were an eye, that chemise which makes haste to rise up and conceal the shoulder for a creaking bit of furniture or a passing vehicle, those cords tied, those clasps fastened, those laces drawn, those tremors, those shivers of cold and modesty, that exquisite affright in every movement, that almost winged uneasiness where there is no cause for alarm, the successive phases of dressing, as charming as the clouds of dawn. It is not fitting that all this should be narrated, and it is too much to have even called attention to it. The eye of man must be more religious in the presence of the rising of a young girl than in the presence of the rising of a star. The possibility of hurting should inspire an augmentation of respect. The down on the peach, the bloom on the plum, the radiated crystal of the snow, the wing of the butterfly powdered with feathers are coarse compared to that chastity which does not even know that it is chaste. The young girl is only the flash of a dream, and is not yet a statue. Her bedchamber is hidden in the somber part of the ideal. The indiscreet touch of a glance brutalizes this vague penumbra. Here, contemplation is profanation. We shall therefore show nothing of that sweet little flutter of Cosette's rising. An Oriental tale relates how the rose was made white by God, but that Adam looked upon her when she was unfolding, and she was ashamed and turned crimson. We are of the number who fall speechless in the presence of young girls and flowers, since we think them worthy of veneration. Cosette dressed herself very hastily, combed and dressed her hair, which was a very simple matter in those days, when women did not swell out their curls and bands with cushions and puffs, and did not put crinoline in their locks. Then she opened the window and cast her eyes around in every direction, hoping to descry some bit of the street, an angle of the house, an edge of pavement, so that she might be able to watch for Marius there. But no view of the outside was to be had. The back court was surrounded by tolerably high walls, and the outlook was only on several gardens. Cosette pronounced these gardens hideous. For the first time in her life she found flowers ugly. The smallest scrap of the gutter of the street would have met her wishes better. She decided to gaze at the sky as though she thought that Marius might come from that quarter. All at once she burst into tears. Not that this was fickleness of soul, but hopes cut in twain by dejection. That was her case. She had a confused consciousness of something horrible. Thoughts were rife in the air, in fact. She told herself that she was not sure of anything, that to withdraw herself from sight was to be lost, and the idea that Marius could return to her from heaven appeared to her no longer charming but mournful. Then, as is the nature of these clouds, calm returned to her, and hope and a sort of unconscious smile, which yet indicated trust in God. Everyone in the house was still asleep. A country-like silence reigned. Not a shutter had been opened. The porter's lodge was closed. Toussaint had not risen, and Cosette naturally thought that her father was asleep. She must have suffered much, and she must have still been suffering greatly, for she said to herself that her father had been unkind. But she counted on Marius. The eclipse of such a light was decidedly impossible. Now and then she heard sharp shocks in the distance, and she said, "It is odd that people should be opening and shutting their carriage gates so early." They were the reports of the cannon battering the barricade. A few feet below Cosette's window, in the ancient and perfectly black cornice of the wall, there was a martin's nest. The curve of this nest formed a little projection beyond the cornice, so that from above it was possible to look into this little paradise. The mother was there, spreading her wings like a fan over her brood. The father fluttered about, flew away, then came back, bearing in his beak food and kisses. The dawning day gilded this happy thing. The great law, multiply, lay there smiling and august, and that sweet mystery unfolded in the glory of the morning. Cosette, with her hair in the sunlight, her soul absorbed in chimeras, illumined by love within and by the dawn without, bent over mechanically, and almost without daring to avow to herself that she was thinking at the same time of Marius, began to gaze at these birds, at this family, at that male and female, that mother and her little ones, with the profound trouble which a nest produces on a virgin. End of Book 1, Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Shot Which Misses Nothing and Kills No One. The assailants' fire continued. Musketry and grape shot alternated, but without committing great ravages, to tell the truth. The top alone of the Corinth façade suffered. The window on the first floor and the attic window in the roof, riddled with buckshot and Biscayans, were slowly losing their shape. The combatants who had been posted there had been obliged to withdraw. However, this is according to the tactics of barricades, to fire for a long while in order to exhaust the insurgents' ammunition if they commit the mistake of replying. When it is perceived from the slackening of their fire that they have no more powder and ball, the assault is made. Enjolras had not fallen into this trap. The barricade did not reply. At every discharge by platoons, Gavroche puffed out his cheek with his tongue, a sign of supreme disdain. "Good for you," said he. "Rip up the cloth. We want some lint." Courfeyrac called the grape-shot to order for the little effect which it produced, and said to the cannon, "You are growing diffuse, my good fellow." One gets puzzled in battle as at a ball. It is probable that this silence on the part of the redoubt began to render the besiegers uneasy, and to make them fear some unexpected incident, and that they felt the necessity of getting a clear view behind that heap of paving stones, and of knowing what was going on behind that impassable wall which received blows without retorting. The insurgents suddenly perceived a helmet glittering in the sun on a neighboring roof. A fireman had placed his back against a tall chimney and seemed to be acting as sentinel. His glance fell directly down into the barricade. "There's an embarrassing watcher," said Enjolras. Jean Valjean had returned Enjolras' rifle, but he had his own gun. Without saying a word, he took aim at the fireman, and a second later the helmet, smashed by a bullet, rattled noisily into the street. The terrified soldier made haste to disappear. A second observer took his place. This one was an officer. Jean Valjean, who had reloaded his gun, took aim at the newcomer and sent the officer's casque to join the soldiers. The officer did not persist and retired speedily. This time the warning was understood. No one made his appearance thereafter on that roof, and the idea of spying on the barricade was abandoned. "Why did you not kill the man, Bossuet?" asked Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean made no reply. End of Book 1, Chapters 9 through 11.
Book 1. The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 12. Disorder a Partisan of Order. Bossuet muttered in Combeferre's ear. He did not answer my question. "He is a man who does good by gunshots," said Combeferre. Those who have preserved some memory of this already distant epoch know that the National Guard from the suburbs was valiant against insurrections. It was particularly zealous and intrepid in the days of June, 1832. A certain good dram shopkeeper of Pantin de Vertu, or La Cunette, whose establishment had been closed by the riots, became leonine at the sight of his deserted dance hall, and got himself killed to preserve the order represented by a tea garden. In that bourgeois and heroic time, in the presence of ideas which had their knights, interests had their paladins, the prosiness of the originators detracted nothing from the bravery of the movement. The diminution of a pile of crowns made bankers sing the Marseillaise. They shed their blood lyrically for the counting-house, and they defended the shop, that immense diminutive of the fatherland, with Lacedaemonian enthusiasm. At bottom, we will observe, there was nothing in all this that was not extremely serious. It was social elements entering into strife, while awaiting the day when they should enter into equilibrium. Another sign of the times was the anarchy mingled with governmentalism, the barbarous name of the correct party. People were for order in combination with a lack of discipline. The drum suddenly beat capricious calls. At the command of such or such a colonel of the National Guard, such and such a captain went into action through inspiration. Such and such National Guardsmen fought for an idea and on their own account. At critical moments, on days, they took counsel less of their leaders than of their instincts. There existed in the army of order veritable guerrillos, some of the sword, like Fannicot, others of the pen, like Henri Fonfrède. Civilization, unfortunately, represented at this epoch rather by an aggregation of interests than by a group of principles, was, or thought itself, in peril. It set up the cry of alarm, each constituting himself a centre, defended it, succoured it, and protected it with his own head, and the first comer took it upon himself to save society. Zeal sometimes proceeded to extermination. A platoon of the National Guard would constitute itself on its own authority a private council of war, and judge and execute a captured insurgent in 5 minutes. It was an improvisation of this sort that had slain Jean Prouvaire. Fierce lynch law, with which no one party had any right to reproach the rest, for it has been applied by the Republic in America as well as by the monarchy in Europe. This lynch law was complicated with mistakes. On one day of rioting, a young poet named Paul M. Garnier was pursued in the Place Royale with a bayonet at his loins, and only escaped by taking refuge under the porte-cochere of number 6. They shouted, "There's another of those Saint-Simonians," and they wanted to kill him. Now, he had under his arm a volume of the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon. A National Guard had read the words Saint-Simon on the book, and had shouted, "Death." On the 6th of June, 1832, a company of the National Guards from the suburbs, commanded by the Captain Fannicot, above mentioned, had itself decimated in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, out of caprice and its own good pleasure. This fact, singular though it may seem, was proved at the judicial investigation opened in consequence of the insurrection of 1832. Captain Fannicot, a bold and impatient bourgeois, a sort of condottiere of the order of those whom we have just characterized, a fanatical and intractable governmentalist, could not resist the temptation to fire prematurely, and the ambition of capturing the barricade alone and unaided, that is to say, with his company. Exasperated by the successive apparition of the red flag and the old coat which he took for the black flag, he loudly blamed the generals and chiefs of the corps, who were holding council and did not think that the moment for decisive assault had arrived, and who were allowing the insurrection to fry in its own fat, to use the celebrated expression of one of them. For his part, he thought the barricade ripe, and as that which is ripe ought to fall, he made the attempt. He commanded men as resolute as himself, raging fellows, as a witness said. His company, the same which had shot Jean Prouvaire the poet, was the first of the battalion posted at the angle of the street. At the moment they were least expecting it, the captain launched his men against the barricade. This movement, executed with more goodwill than strategy, cost the Fannicot company dear. Before it had traversed 2/3 of the street, it was received by a general discharge from the barricade. 4, the most audacious, who were running on in front, were mown down point-blank at the very foot of the redoubt, and this courageous throng of National Guards, very brave men, but lacking in military tenacity, were forced to fall back, after some hesitation, leaving 15 corpses on the pavement. This momentary hesitation gave the insurgents time to reload their weapons, and a second and very destructive discharge struck the company before it could regain the corner of the street, its shelter. A moment more, and it was caught between 2 fires, and it received the volley from the battery piece, which, not having received the order, had not discontinued its firing. The intrepid and imprudent Fannicot was one of the dead from this grape-shot. He was killed by the cannon, that is to say, by order. This attack, which was more furious than serious, irritated Enjolras. "The fools," said he. "They are getting their own men killed, and they are using up our ammunition for nothing." Enjolras spoke like the real general of the insurrection, which he was. Insurrection and repression do not fight with equal weapons. Insurrection, which is speedily exhausted, has only a certain number of shots to fire and a certain number of combatants to expend. An empty cartridge box, a man killed, cannot be replaced. As repression has the army, it does not count its men, and as it has Vincennes, it does not count its shots. Repression has as many regiments as the barricade has men, and as many arsenals as the barricade has cartridge boxes. Thus they are struggles of 1 against 100, which always end in crushing the barricade, unless the revolution, uprising suddenly, flings into the balance its flaming archangel's sword. This does happen sometimes. Then everything rises, the pavements begin to seethe, popular redoubts abound. Paris quivers supremely. The quid divinum is given forth. A 10th of August is in the air, a 29th of July is in the air. A wonderful light appears. The yawning maw of force draws back, and the army, that lion, sees before it, erect and tranquil, that prophet, France. Chapter 13. Passing Gleams. In the chaos of sentiments and passions which defend a barricade, there is a little of everything. There is bravery, there is youth, honor, enthusiasm, the ideal, conviction, the rage of the gambler, and, above all, intermittences of hope. One of these intermittences, one of these vague quivers of hope, suddenly traversed the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, at the moment when it was least expected. "Listen!" suddenly cried Enjolras, who was still on the watch. "It seems to me that Paris is waking up." It is certain that, on the morning of the 6th of June, the insurrection broke out afresh for an hour or two, to a certain extent. The obstinacy of the alarm peal of Saint-Merry reanimated some fancies. Barricades were begun in the Rue du Poirier and the Rue des Gravilliers. In front of the Porte Saint-Martin, a young man, armed with a rifle, attacked alone a squadron of cavalry. In plain sight, on the open boulevard, he placed one knee on the ground, shouldered his weapon, fired, killed the commander of the squadron, and turned away, saying, "There's another who will do us no more harm." He was put to the sword. In the Rue Saint-Denis, a woman fired on the National Guard from behind a lowered blind. The slats of the blind could be seen to tremble at every shot. A child 14 years of age was arrested in the Rue de la Cossonnerie, with his pockets full of cartridges. Many posts were attacked. At the entrance to the Rue Bertin-Poiré, a very lively and utterly unexpected fusillade welcomed a regiment of cuirassiers, at whose head marched Marshal General Cavaignan de Baraque. In the Rue Planche-Mibray, they threw old pieces of pottery and household utensils down on the soldiers from the roofs. A bad sign, and when this matter was reported to Marshal Soult, Napoleon's old lieutenant grew thoughtful, as he recalled Suchet's saying at Saragossa, "We are lost when the old women empty their pot de chambre on our heads." These general symptoms, which presented themselves at the moment when it was thought that the uprising had been rendered local, this fever of wrath, these sparks which flew hither and thither above those deep masses of combustibles which are called the faubourgs of Paris, all this, taken together, disturbed the military chiefs. They made haste to stamp out these beginnings of conflagration. They delayed the attack on the barricades Maubert, de la Chauvière, and Saint-Merry until these sparks had been extinguished, in order that they might have to deal with the barricades only, and be able to finish them at one blow. Columns were thrown into the streets where there was fermentation, sweeping the large, sounding the small right and left, now slowly and cautiously, now at full charge. The troops broke in the doors of houses whence shots had been fired. At the same time, maneuvers by the cavalry dispersed the groups on the boulevards. This repression was not effected without some commotion, and without that tumultuous uproar peculiar to collisions between the army and the people. This is what Enjolras had caught up in the intervals of the cannonade and the musketry. Moreover, he had seen wounded men passing the end of the street in litters, and he said to Courfeyrac, "These wounded do not come from us." Their hope did not last long. The gleam was quickly eclipsed. In less than half an hour, what was in the air vanished. It was a flash of lightning, unaccompanied by thunder, and the insurgents felt that sort of leaden cope, with the indifference of the people casts over obstinate and deserted men, fall over them once more. The general movement, which seemed to have assumed a vague outline, had miscarried, and the attention of the Minister of War and the strategy of the generals could now be concentrated on the 3 or 4 barricades which still remained standing. The sun was mounting above the horizon. An insurgent hailed Enjolras. "We are hungry here. Are we really going to die like this, without anything to eat?" Enjolras, who was still leaning on his elbows at his embrasure, made an affirmative sign with his head, but without taking his eyes from the end of the street. End of Book 1, Chapter 13. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls, Chapters 14 to 15. Chapter 14, wherein will appear the name of Enjolras' mistress. Courfeyrac, seated on a paving stone beside Enjolras, continued to insult the cannon, and each time that gloomy cloud of projectiles, which is called grape-shot, passed overhead with its terrible sound, he assailed it with a burst of irony. "You are wearing out your lungs, poor, brutal old fellow. You pain me. You are wasting your row. That's not thunder, it's a cough." And the bystanders laughed. Courfeyrac and Bossuet, whose brave good humour increased with the peril, like Madame Scarron, replaced nourishment with pleasantry, and as wine was lacking, they poured out gaiety to all. "I admire Enjolras," said Bossuet. "His impassive temerity astounds me. He lives alone, which renders him a little sad, perhaps. Enjolras complains of his greatness, which binds him to widowhood. The rest of us have mistresses, more or less, who make us crazy, that is to say, brave. When a man is as much in love as a tiger, the least that he can do is fight like a lion. That is one way of taking our revenge for the capers that Mesdames our grisettes play on us. Roland gets himself killed for Angelique. All our heroism comes from our women. A man without a woman is a pistol without a trigger. It is the woman that sets the man off. Well, Enjolras has no woman. He is not in love, and yet he manages to be intrepid. It is a thing unheard of that a man should be as cold as ice and as bold as fire. Enjolras did not appear to be listening, but had anyone been near him, that person would have heard him mutter in a low voice, "Patria." Bossuet was still laughing when Courfeyrac exclaimed, "News!" and, assuming the tone of an usher making an announcement, he added, "My name is 8-pounder." In fact, a new personage had entered on the scene. This was a second piece of ordnance. The artillerymen rapidly performed their manoeuvres in force, and placed this second piece in line with the first. This outlined the catastrophe. A few minutes later, the two pieces, rapidly served, were firing point-blank at the redoubt. The platoon, firing of the line and of the soldiers from the suburbs, sustained the artillery. Another cannonade was audible at some distance. At the same time that the two guns were furiously attacking the redoubt from the Rue de la Chanvrerie, two other cannons, trained one from the Rue Saint-Denis, the other from the Rue Aubry-le-Boucher, were riddling the Saint-Merry barricade. The four cannons echoed each other mournfully. The barking of these sombre dogs of war replied to each other. One of the two pieces which was now battering the barricade on the Rue de la Chanvrerie was firing grape-shot, the other balls. The piece which was firing balls was pointed a little high, and the aim was calculated so that the ball struck the extreme edge of the upper crest of the barricade, and crumbled the stone down upon the insurgents, mingled with bursts of grape-shot. The object of this mode of firing was to drive the insurgents from the summit of the redoubt, and to compel them to gather close in the interior, that is to say, this announced the assault. The combatants, once driven from the crest of the barricade by balls, and from the windows of the cabaret by grape-shot, the attacking columns could venture into the street without being picked off, perhaps even without being seen, could briskly and suddenly scale the redoubt, as on the preceding evening, and, who knows, take it by surprise. "It is absolutely necessary that the inconvenience of those guns should be diminished," said Enjolras, and he shouted, "Fire on the artillerymen!" All were ready. The barricade, which had long been silent, poured forth a desperate fire. 7 or 8 discharges followed, with a sort of rage and joy. The street was filled with blinding smoke, and at the end of a few minutes, athwart this mist all streaked with flame, 2/3 of the gunners could be distinguished lying beneath the wheels of the cannons. Those who were left standing continued to serve the pieces with severe tranquillity, but the fire had slackened. "Things are going well now," said Bossuet to Enjolras. "Success!" Enjolras shook his head and replied, "Another quarter of an hour of this success, and there will not be any cartridges left in the barricade." It appears that Gavroche overheard this remark. Chapter 15. Gavroche outside. Courfeyrac suddenly caught sight of someone at the base of the barricade, outside in the street, amid the bullets. Gavroche had taken a bottle basket from the wine-shop, had made his way out through the cut, and was quietly engaged in emptying the full cartridge boxes of the National Guardsmen, who had been killed on the slope of the redoubt, into his basket. "What are you doing there?" asked Courfeyrac. Gavroche raised his face. "I'm filling my basket, citizen." "Don't you see the grape-shot?" Gavroche replied, "Well, it is raining, what then?" Courfeyrac shouted, "Come in!" "Instanter," said Gavroche, and with a single bound he plunged into the street. It will be remembered that Fannicot's company had left behind it a trail of bodies. 20 corpses lay scattered here and there on the pavement through the whole length of the street. 20 cartouches for Gavroche meant a provision of cartridges for the barricade. The smoke in the street was like a fog. Whoever has beheld a cloud which has fallen into a mountain gorge between two peaked escarpments can imagine this smoke rendered denser and thicker by 2 gloomy rows of lofty houses. It rose gradually and was incessantly renewed, hence a twilight which made even the broad daylight turn pale. The combatants could hardly see each other from one end of the street to the other, short as it was. This obscurity, which had probably been desired and calculated on by the commanders who were to direct the assault on the barricade, was useful to Gavroche. Beneath the folds of this veil of smoke, and thanks to his small size, he could advance tolerably far into the street without being seen. He rifled the first 7 or 8 cartridge boxes without much danger. He crawled flat on his belly, galloped on all fours, took his basket in his teeth, twisted, glided, undulated, wound from one dead body to another, and emptied the cartridge box or cartouche as a monkey opens a nut. They did not dare to shout to him to return from the barricade, which was quite near, for fear of attracting attention to him. On one body, that of a corporal, he found a powder flask. "For thirst," said he, putting it in his pocket. By dint of advancing, he reached a point where the fog of the fusillade became transparent, so that the sharpshooters of the line ranged on the outlook behind their paving stone dike, and the sharpshooters of the banlieue massed at the corner of the street suddenly pointed out to each other something moving through the smoke. At the moment when Gavroche was relieving a sergeant who was lying near a stone doorpost of his cartridges, a bullet struck the body. "Fichtre!" ejaculated Gavroche, "they are killing my dead men for me." A second bullet struck a spark from the pavement beside him, a third overturned his basket. Gavroche looked and saw that this came from the men of the banlieue. He sprang to his feet, stood erect, with his hair flying in the wind, his hands on his hips, his eyes fixed on the National Guardsmen who were firing, and sang: "On est laïd à Nanterre, c'est la faute à Voltaire, et bête à Palaiseau, c'est la faute à Rousseau. Men are ugly at Nanterre, 'tis the fault of Voltaire, and dull at Palaiseau, 'tis the fault of Rousseau." Then he picked up his basket, replaced the cartridges which had fallen from it without missing a single one, and advancing toward the fusillade, set about plundering another cartridge box. There a fourth bullet missed him again. Gavroche sang: "Je ne suis pas notaire, c'est la faute à Voltaire. Je suis un petit oiseau, c'est la faute à Rousseau." I am not a notary, 'tis the fault of Voltaire. I'm a little bird, 'tis the fault of Rousseau. A fifth bullet only succeeded in drawing from him a third couplet: "Joie est mon caractère, c'est la faute à Voltaire. Misère est mon trousseau, c'est la faute à Rousseau." Joy is my character, 'tis the fault of Voltaire. Misery is my trousseau, 'tis the fault of Rousseau. Thus it went on for some time. It was a charming and terrible sight. Gavroche, though shot at, was teasing the fusillade. He had the air of being greatly diverted. It was the sparrow pecking at the sportsman. To each discharge he retorted with a couplet. They aimed at him constantly and always missed him. The National Guardsmen and the soldiers laughed as they took aim at him. He lay down, sprang to his feet, hid in the corner of a doorway, then made a bound, disappeared, reappeared, scampered away, returned, replied to the grape-shot with his thumb at his nose, and all the while went on pillaging the cartouches, emptying the cartridge boxes, and filling his basket. The insurgents, panting with anxiety, followed him with their eyes. The barricade trembled. He sang. He was not a child, he was not a man, he was a strange gammon fairy. He might have been called the invulnerable dwarf of the fray. The bullets flew after him, he was more nimble than they. He played a fearful game of hide-and-seek with death. Every time that the flat-nosed face of the spectre approached, the urchin administered to it a fillip. One bullet, however, better aimed or more treacherous than the rest, finally struck the will-o'-the-wisp of a child. Gavroche was seen to stagger, then he sank to the earth. The whole barricade gave vent to a cry, but there was something of Antaeus in that pygmy. For the gamin to touch the pavement is the same as for the giant to touch the earth. Gavroche had fallen only to rise again. He remained in a sitting posture, a long thread of blood streaked his face. He raised both arms in the air, glanced in the direction whence the shot had come, and began to sing. Je suis tombé par terre, c'est la faute à Voltaire. Le nez dans le ruisseau, c'est la faute à... I have fallen to the earth, 'tis the fault of Voltaire. With my nose in the gutter, 'tis the fault of... He did not finish. A second bullet from the same marksman stopped him short. This time he fell face downward on the pavement, and moved no more. This grand little soul had taken its flight. End of Book 1, Chapters 14 to 15.
Book 1, Chapter 16. How from a brother one becomes a father. At that same moment in the garden of the Luxembourg, for the gaze of the drama must be everywhere present, two children were holding each other by the hand. One might have been 7 years old, the other 5. The rain having soaked them, they were walking along the paths on the sunny side. The elder was leading the younger. They were pale and ragged. They had the air of wild birds. The smaller of them said, "I am very hungry." The elder, who was already somewhat of a protector, was leading his brother with his left hand, and in his right he carried a small stick. They were alone in the garden. The garden was deserted. The gates had been closed by order of the police on account of the insurrection. The troops who had been bivouacking there had departed for the exigencies of combat. How did those children come there? Perhaps they had escaped from some guard-house which stood ajar. Perhaps there was in the vicinity, at the Barrière d'Enfer, or in the Esplanade de l'Observatoire, or in the neighbouring carrefour, dominated by the pediment on which could be read, "Invenerunt parvulum panis involutum," some mountebank's booth from which they had fled. Perhaps they had on the previous evening escaped the eye of the inspectors of the garden at the hour of closing, and had passed the night in some one of those sentry boxes where people read the papers. The fact is, they were stray lambs, and they seemed free. To be astray and to seem free is to be lost. These poor little creatures were, in fact, lost. These two children were the same over whom Gavroche had been put to some trouble, as the reader will recollect. Children of the Thénardier, leased out to Magnon, attributed to Monsieur Gillenormand. And now leaves fallen from all these rootless branches and swept over the ground by the wind. Their clothing, which had been clean in Magnon's day, and which had served her as a prospectus with Monsieur Gillenormand, had been converted into rags. Henceforth these beings belonged to the statistics as abandoned children, whom the police took note of, collect, mislay, and find again on the pavements of Paris. It required the disturbance of a day like that to account for these miserable little creatures being in that garden. If the superintendents had caught sight of them, they would have driven such rags forth. Poor little things do not enter public gardens. Still, people should reflect that as children they have a right to flowers. These children were there thanks to the locked gates. They were there contrary to the regulations. They had slipped into the garden, and there they remained. Closed gates do not dismiss the inspectors. Oversight is supposed to continue, but it grows slack and reposes, and the inspectors, moved by the public anxiety, and more occupied with the outside than the inside, no longer glanced into the garden, and had not seen the two delinquents. It had rained the night before, and even a little in the morning. But in June showers do not count for much. An hour after storm it can hardly be seen that the beautiful Blondet has wept. The earth in summer is as quickly dried as the cheek of a child. At that period of the solstice, the light of full noonday is, so to speak, poignant. It takes everything. It applies itself to the earth and superposes itself with a sort of suction. One would say that the sun was thirsty. A shower is but a glass of water. A rainstorm is instantly drunk up. In the morning everything was dripping. In the afternoon everything is powdered over. Nothing is so worthy of admiration as foliage washed by the rain and wiped by the rays of sunlight. It is warm freshness. The gardens and meadows, having water at their roots and sun in their flowers, become perfuming pans of incense, and smoke with all their odours at once. Everything smiles, sings, and offers itself. One feels greatly intoxicated. The springtime is a provisional paradise. The sun helps man to have patience. There are beings who demand nothing further. Mortals who, having the azure of heaven, say, "It is enough." dreamers absorbed in the wonderful, dipping into the idolatry of nature, indifferent to good and evil, contemplators of cosmos and radiantly forgetful of man, who do not understand how people can occupy themselves with the hunger of these and the thirst of those, with the nudity of the poor in winter, with the lymphatic curvature of the little spinal column, with the pallet, the attic, the dungeon, and the rags of shivering young girls, when they can dream beneath the trees, peaceful and terrible spirits they, and pitilessly satisfied. Strange to say, the infinite suffices them. That great need of man, the finite, which admits of embrace, they ignore. The finite, which admits of progress and sublime toil, they do not think about. The indefinite, which is born from the human and divine combination of the infinite and the finite, escapes them. Provided that they are face to face with immensity, they smile. Joy? Never. Ecstasy forever. Their life lies in surrendering their personality in contemplation. The history of humanity is for them only a detailed plan. All is not there. The true all remains without. What is the use of busying oneself over that detail, man? Man suffers, that's quite possible. But look at Aldebaran rising. The mother has no more milk, the newborn babe is dying. I know nothing about that. But just look at this wonderful rosette, which a slice of wood cells of the pine present under the microscope. Compare the most beautiful Mechlin lace to that, if you can. These thinkers forget to love. The zodiac thrives with them to such a point that it prevents their seeing the weeping child. God eclipses their souls. This is a family of minds which are at once great and petty. Horace was one of them. So was Goethe. La Fontaine? Perhaps. Magnificent egoists of the infinite, tranquil spectators of sorrow, who do not behold Nero if the weather be fair, for whom the sun conceals a funeral pile, who would look on at an execution by the guillotine in the search for an effective light, who hear neither the cry, nor the sob, nor the death rattle, nor the alarm peal, for whom everything is well since there is a month of May, who so long as there are clouds of purple and gold above their heads declare themselves content, and who are determined to be happy until the radiance of the stars and the songs of the birds are exhausted. These are dark radiances. They have no suspicion that they are to be pitied. Certainly they are so. He who does not weep does not see. They are to be admired and pitied, as one would both pity and admire a being at once night and day, without eyes beneath his lashes, but with a star on his brow. The indifference of these thinkers is, according to some, a superior philosophy. That may be. But in this superiority there is some infirmity. One may be immortal and yet limp, witness Vulcan. One may be more than man and less than man. There is incomplete immensity in nature. Who knows whether the sun is not a blind man? But then what? In whom can we trust? Solum quis dicere falsum audiat? Who shall dare to say that the sun is false? Thus certain geniuses themselves, certain very lofty mortals, man-stars, may be mistaken. That which is on high at the summit, at the crest, at the zenith, that which sends down so much light on the earth, sees but little, sees badly, sees not at all. Is not this a desperate state of things? No. But what is there then above the sun? The God. On the 6th of June, 1832, about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Luxembourg, solitary and depopulated, was charming. The quincunxes and flower beds shed forth balm and dazzling beauty into the sunlight. The branches, wild with the brilliant glow of midday, seemed endeavoring to embrace. In the sycamores there was an uproar of linnets. Sparrows triumphed. Woodpeckers climbed among the chestnut trees, administering little pecks on the bark. The flower beds accepted the legitimate royalty of the lilies. The most august of perfumes is that which emanates from whiteness. The peppery odor of the carnations was perceptible. The old crows of Marie de Medici were amorous in the tall trees. The sun, gilded, empurpled, set fire to and lighted up the tulips, which are nothing but all the varieties of flame made into flowers. All around the banks of tulips the bees, the sparks of these flame flowers, hummed. All was grace and gaiety, even the impending rain. This relapse by which the lilies of the valley and the honeysuckles were destined to profit had nothing disturbing about it. The swallows indulged in the charming threat of flying low. He who was there aspired to happiness. Life smelled good. All nature exhaled candor, help, assistance, paternity, caress, dawn. The thoughts which fell from heaven were as sweet as a tiny hand of a baby when one kisses it. The statues under the trees, white and nude, had robes of shadow pierced with light. These goddesses were all tattered with sunlight. Rays hung from them on all sides. Around the great fountain the earth was already dried up to the point of being burnt. There was sufficient breeze to raise little insurrections of dust here and there. A few yellow leaves left over from the autumn chased each other merrily, and seemed to be playing tricks on each other. This abundance of light had something indescribably reassuring about it. Life, sap, heat, odors overflowed. One was conscious beneath creation of the enormous size of the source. In all these breaths permeated with love. In this interchange of reverberations and reflections, in this marvelous expenditure of rays, in this infinite outpouring of liquid gold, one felt the prodigality of the inexhaustible, and behind the splendor, as behind a curtain of flame, one caught a glimpse of God, that millionaire of stars. Thanks to the sand, there was not a speck of mud. Thanks to the rain, there was not a grain of ashes. The clumps of blossoms had just been bathed. Every sort of velvet, satin, gold, and varnish, which springs from the earth in the form of flowers, was irreproachable. This magnificence was cleanly. The grand silence of happy nature filled the garden, a celestial silence that is compatible with 1,000 sorts of music, the cooing of nests, the buzzing of swarms, the flutterings of the breeze. All the harmony of the season was complete in one gracious whole. The entrances and exits of spring took place in proper order. The lilacs ended, the jasmine began. Some flowers were tardy, some insects in advance of their time. The vanguard of the red June butterflies fraternized with the rearguard of the white butterflies of May. The plantain trees were getting their new skins. The breeze hollowed out undulations in the magnificent enormity of the chestnut trees. It was splendid. A veteran from the neighboring barracks, who was gazing through the fence, said, "Here's a spring presenting arms and in full uniform." All nature was breakfasting. Creation was at table. This was its hour. The great blue cloth was spread in the sky, and the great green cloth on earth. The sun lighted it all up brilliantly. God was serving the universal repast. Each creature had his pasture or his mess. The ringdove found his hemp seed. The chaffinch found his millet. The goldfinch found chickweed. The redbreast found worms. The greenfinch found flies. The fly found infusorii. The bee found flowers. They ate each other somewhat, it is true, which is the misery of evil mixed with good, but not a beast of them all had an empty stomach. The two little abandoned creatures had arrived in the vicinity of the grand fountain, and rather bewildered by all this light, they tried to hide themselves. The instinct of the poor and the weak in the presence of even impersonal magnificence, and they kept behind the swan's hutch. Here and there, at intervals when the wind blew, shouts, clamours, a sort of tumultuous death rattle, which was the firing and dull blows, which were discharges of cannon, struck the ear confusedly. Smoke hung over the roofs in the direction of the Hall. A bell, which had the air of an appeal, was ringing in the distance. These children did not appear to notice these noises. The little one repeated from time to time, "I am hungry." Almost at the same instant with the children, another couple approached the great basin. They consisted of a good man about 50 years of age, who was leading by the hand a little fellow of 6, no doubt a father and his son. The little man of 6 had a big brioche. At that epoch, certain houses abutting on the river in the Rue Madame and d'Enfer had keys to the Luxembourg garden, of which the lodgers enjoyed the use when the gates were shut, a privilege which was suppressed later on. This father and son came from one of these houses, no doubt. The two poor little creatures watched that gentleman approaching and hid themselves a little more thoroughly. He was a bourgeois, the same person perhaps whom Marius had one day heard through his love fever near the same grand basin, counselling his son to avoid excesses. He had an affable and haughty air, and a mouth which was always smiling, since it did not shut. This mechanical smile, produced by too much jaw and too little skin, shows the teeth rather than the soul. The child, with his brioche, which he had bitten into but had not finished eating, seemed satiated. The child was dressed as a National Guardsman owing to the insurrection, and the father had remained clad as a bourgeois out of prudence. Father and son halted near the fountain, where 2 swans were sporting. This bourgeois appeared to cherish a special admiration for the swans. He resembled them in this sense, that he walked like them. For the moment the swans were swimming, which is their principal talent, and they were superb. If the 2 poor little beings had listened, and if they had been of an age to understand, they might have gathered the words of this grave man. The father was saying to his son, "The sage lives content with little. Look at me, my son. I do not love pomp. I am never seen in clothes decked with gold lace and stones. I leave that false splendor to badly organized souls." Here the deep shouts which proceeded from the direction of the Halles burst out with fresh force of bell and uproar. "What is that?" inquired the child. The father replied, "It is a Saturnalia." All at once he caught sight of the 2 little ragged boys behind the green swan hutch. "There's the beginning," said he. And after a pause he added, "Anarchy is entering this garden." In the meanwhile his son took a bite of his brioche, spit it out, and suddenly burst out crying. "What are you crying about?" demanded his father. "I am not hungry any more," said the child. The father's smile became more accentuated. "One does not need to be hungry in order to eat a cake." "My cake tires me. It's stale." "Don't you want any more of it?" "No." The father pointed to the swans. "Throw it to those palmipeds." The child hesitated. A person may not want any more of his cake, but that's no reason for giving it away. The father went on. "Be humane. You must have compassion on animals." And taking the cake from his son, he flung it into the basin. The cake fell very near the edge. The swans were far away in the centre of the basin and busy with some prey. They had seen neither the bourgeois nor the brioche. The bourgeois, feeling that the cake was in danger of being wasted, and moved by this useless shipwreck, entered upon a telegraphic agitation, which finally attracted the attention of the swans. They perceived something floating, steered for the edge like ships as they are, and slowly directed their course toward the brioche, with the stupid majesty which befits white creatures. "The swans, signes, understand signs, signe," said the bourgeois, delighted to make a jest. At that moment the distant tumult of the city underwent another sudden increase. This time it was sinister. There are some gusts of wind which speak more distinctly than others. The one which was blowing at that moment brought clearly defined drumbeats, clamours, platoon firing, and the dismal replies of the tocsin and the cannon. This coincided with a black cloud which suddenly veiled the sun. The swans had not yet reached the brioche. "Let us return home," said the father. "They are attacking the Tuileries." He grasped his son's hand again. Then he continued, "From the Tuileries to the Luxembourg there's but the distance which separates royalty from the peerage. That's not far. Shots will soon rain down." He glanced at the cloud. "Perhaps it's rain itself that's about to shower down. The sky is joining in. The younger branch is condemned. Let us return home quickly. "I should like to see the swans eat the brioche," said the child. The father replied, "That would be imprudent," and he led his little bourgeois away. The son, regretting the swans, turned his head back toward the basin until a corner of the quincunxes concealed it from him. In the meanwhile, the two little waifs had approached the brioche at the same time as the swans. It was floating on the water. The smaller of them stared at the cake. The elder gazed after the retreating bourgeois. Father and son entered the labyrinth of walks which leads to the grand flight of steps near the clump of trees on the side of the Rue Madame. As soon as they had disappeared from view, the elder child hastily flung himself flat on his stomach on the rounding curb of the basin, and clinging to it with his left hand, and leaning over the water on the verge of falling in, he stretched out his right hand with his stick towards the cake. The swans, perceiving the enemy, made haste, and in so doing they produced an effect of their breasts which was of service to the little fisher. The water flowed back before the swans, and one of these gentle concentric undulations softly floated the brioche towards the child's wand. Just as the swans came up, the stick touched the cake. The child gave it a brisk rap, drew in the brioche, frightened away the swans, seized the cake, and sprang to his feet. The cake was wet, but they were hungry and thirsty. The elder broke the cake into two portions, a large one and a small one, took the small one for himself, gave the large one to his brother, and said to him, "Ram that into your muzzle." End of Book 1, Chapter 16, recorded by Karen.
Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 17, Mortuus pater filium moriturum expectat. Marius dashed out of the barricade. Combeferre followed him, but he was too late. Gavroche was dead. Combeferre brought back the basket of cartridges. Marius bore the child. Alas, he thought, that which the father had done for his father he was requiting to the son. Only Thénardier had brought back his father alive. He was bringing back the child dead. When Marius re-entered the redoubt with Gavroche in his arms, his face, like the child, was inundated with blood. At the moment when he had stooped to lift Gavroche, a bullet had grazed his head. He had not noticed it. Courfeyrac untied his cravat, and with it bandaged Marius's brow. They laid Gavroche on the same table with Mabeuf, and spread over the two corpses the black shawl. There was enough of it for both the old man and the child. Combeferre distributed the cartridges from the basket which he had brought in. This gave each man 15 rounds to fire. Jean Valjean was still in the same place, motionless on his stone post. When Combeferre offered him his 15 cartridges, he shook his head. "He's a rare eccentric," said Combeferre in a low voice to Enjolras. "He finds a way of not fighting in this barricade." "Which does not prevent him from defending it," responded Enjolras. "Heroism has its originals," resumed Combeferre. And Courfeyrac, who had overheard, added, "He is another sort from Father Mabeuf." One thing which must be noted is that the fire which was battering the barricade hardly disturbed the interior. Those who have never traversed the whirlwind of this sort of war can form no idea of the singular moments of tranquillity mingled with these convulsions. Men go and come, they talk, they jest, they lounge. Someone who we know heard a combatant say to him in the midst of the grape shot, "We are here as at a bachelor breakfast." The redoubt of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, we repeat, seemed very calm within. All mutations and all phases had been or were about to be exhausted. The position from critical had become menacing, and from menacing was probably about to become desperate. In proportion as the situation grew gloomy, the glow of heroism empurpled the barricade more and more. Enjolras, who was grave, dominated it, in the attitude of a young Spartan sacrificing his naked sword to the sombre genius Epidotas. Combeferre, wearing an apron, was dressing the wounds. Bossuet and Feuilly were making cartridges with the powder flask picked up by Gavroche on the dead corporal. and Bossuet said to Feuilly, "We are soon to take the diligence for another planet." Courfeyrac was disposing and arranging on some paving stones which he had reserved for himself near Enjolras, a complete arsenal, his sword cane, his gun, 2 holster pistols, and a cudgel, with the care of a young girl setting a small dunkerque in order. Jean Valjean stared silently at the wall opposite him. An artisan was fastening Mother Huchelot's big straw hat on his head with a string, for fear of sunstroke, as he said. The young men from the Cougourde d'Ail were chatting merrily among themselves, as though eager to speak patois for the last time. Joly, who had taken Widow Huchelot's mirror from the wall, was examining his tongue in it. Some combatants, having discovered a few crusts of rather mouldy bread in a drawer, were eagerly devouring them. Marius was disturbed with regard to what his father was about to say to him. Chapter 18. The vulture become prey. We must insist upon one psychological fact peculiar to barricades. Nothing which is characteristic of that surprising war of the streets should be omitted. Whatever may have been the singular inward tranquillity which we have just mentioned, the barricade, for those who are inside it, remains none the less a vision. There is something of the apocalypse in civil war. All the mists of the unknown are commingled with fierce flashes. Revolutions are sphinxes, and anyone who has passed through a barricade thinks he has traversed a dream. The feelings to which one is subject in these places we have pointed out in the case of Marius, and we shall see the consequences. They are both more or less than life. On emerging from a barricade, one no longer knows what one has seen there. One has been terrible, but one knows it not. One has been surrounded with conflicting ideas which had human faces. One's head has been in the light of the future. There were corpses lying prone there, and phantoms standing erect. The hours were colossal and seemed hours of eternity. One has lived in death. Shadows have passed by. What were they? One has beheld hands on which there was blood. There was a deafening horror. There was also a frightful silence. There were open mouths which shouted, and other open mouths which held their peace. One was in the midst of smoke, of night perhaps. One fancied that one had touched the sinister ooze of unknown depths. One stares at something red on one's fingernails. One no longer remembers anything. Let us return to the Rue de la Chanvrerie. All at once, between 2 discharges, the distant sound of a clock striking the hour became audible. "It is midday," said Combeferre. The 12 strokes had not finished striking when Enjolras sprang to his feet, and from the summit of the barricade hurled this thundering shout: "Carry stones up into the houses! Line the window-sills and the roofs with them! Half the men to their guns, the other half to the paving stones! There is not a minute to be lost!" A squad of sappers and miners, axe on shoulder, had just made their appearance in battle array at the end of the street. This could only be the head of a column. And of what column? The attacking column, evidently. The sappers charged with the demolition of the barricade must always precede the soldiers who are to scale it. They were evidently on the brink of that moment which Monsieur Clermont-Tonnerre in 1822 called the tug of war. Enjolras's order was executed with the correct haste which is peculiar to ships and barricades. The only 2 scenes of combat where escape is impossible. In less than a minute, 2/3 of the stones which Enjolras had piled up at the door of the Corinthe had been gathered up to the first floor in the attic, and before a second minute had elapsed, these stones, artistically set one upon the other, walled up the sash window on the first floor and the windows in the roof to half their height. A few loopholes, carefully planned by Feuilly, the principal architect, allowed of the passage of the gun barrels. The armament of the windows could be erected all the more easily since the firing of grape shot had ceased. The 2 cannons were now discharging ball against the centre of a barrier in order to make a hole there, and, if possible, a breach for the assault. When the stones destined to the final defence were in place, Enjolras had the bottles which he had set under the table where Mabeuf lay, carried to the first floor. "Who is to drink that?" Bossuet asked him. "They," replied Enjolras. Then they barricaded the window below and held in readiness the iron crossbars which served to secure the door of the wine shop at night. The fortress was complete. The barricade was the rampart. The wine shop was the dungeon. With the stones which remained, they stopped up the outlet. As the defenders of a barricade are always obliged to be sparing of their ammunition, and as the assailants know this, the assailants combine their arrangements with a sort of irritating leisure, expose themselves to fire prematurely, though in appearance more than in reality, and take their ease. The preparations for attack are always made with certain methodical deliberation, after which the lightning strikes. This deliberation permitted Enjolras to take a review of everything and to perfect everything. He felt that, since such men were to die, their death ought to be a masterpiece. He said to Marius, "We are the two leaders. I will give the last orders inside. Do you remain outside and observe." Marius posted himself on the lookout upon the crest of the barricade. Enjolras had the door of the kitchen, which was the ambulance, as the reader will remember, nailed up. "No splashing of the wounded," he said. He issued his final orders in the tap-room in a curt but profoundly tranquil tone. Feuilly listened and replied in the name of all. "On the first floor, hold your axes in readiness to cut the staircase. Have you them?" "Yes," said Feuilly. "How many?" "2 axes and a pole-axe." "That is good. There are now 26 combatants of us on foot. How many guns are there?" 34. 8 too many. Keep those 8 guns loaded like the rest and at hand. Swords and pistols in your belts. 20 men to the barricade. 6 ambushed in the attic windows and the window on the first floor to fire on the assailants through the loopholes in the stones. Let not a single worker remain inactive here. Presently, when the drum beats the assault, let the 20 below stairs rush to the barricade. The first to arrive will have the best places. These arrangements made, he turned to Javert and said, "I am not forgetting you." And laying a pistol on the table, he added, "The last man to leave this room will smash the skull of this spy." "Here?" inquired a voice. "No, let us not mix their corpses with our own. The little barricade of the Montedure lane can be scaled. It is only 4 feet high. The man is well pinioned. He shall be taken thither and put to death." There was someone who was more impassive at that moment than Enjolras. It was Javert. Here Jean Valjean made his appearance. He had been lost among the group of insurgents. He stepped forth and said to Enjolras, "You are the commander?" "Yes." "You thanked me a while ago." "In the name of a republic. The barricade has 2 saviors, Marius Pontmercy and yourself." "Do you think that I deserve a recompense?" "Certainly." "Well, I request one." "What is it?" "That I may blow that man's brains out." Javert raised his head, saw Jean Valjean, made an almost imperceptible movement, and said, "That is just." As for Enjolras, he had begun to reload his rifle. He cut his eyes about him. No objections. And he turned to Jean Valjean. "Take the spy." Jean Valjean did, in fact, take possession of Javert by seating himself on the end of the table. He seized the pistol, and a faint click announced that he had cocked it. Almost at the same moment, a blast of trumpets became audible. "Take care!" shouted Marius from the top of the barricade. Javert began to laugh with that noiseless laugh which was peculiar to him, and gazing intently at the insurgents, he said to them, "You are in no better case than I am." "All out!" shouted Enjolras. The insurgents poured out tumultuously, and as they went received in the back, may we be permitted the expression, this sally of Javert's. We shall meet again shortly. Chapter 19. Jean Valjean takes his revenge. When Jean Valjean was left alone with Javert, he untied the rope which fastened the prisoner across the middle of the body, and the knot of which was under the table. After this he made him a sign to rise. Javert obeyed with that indefinable smile in which the supremacy of enchained authority is condensed. Jean Valjean took Javert by the martingale, as one would take a beast of burden by the breastband, and dragging the latter after him, emerged from the wine-shop slowly, because Javert, with his impeded limbs, could take only very short steps. Jean Valjean had the pistol in his hand. In this manner they crossed the inner trapezium of the barricade. The insurgents, all intent on the attack which was imminent, had their backs turned to these two. Marius, alone stationed on one side at the extreme left of the barricade, saw them pass. This group of victim and executioner was illuminated by the sepulchral light which he bore in his own soul. Jean Valjean, with some difficulty, but without relaxing his hold for a single instant, made Javert, pinioned as he was, scale the little entrenchment in the Montedor lane. When they had crossed this barrier, they found themselves alone in the lane. No one saw them. Among the heap, they could distinguish a livid face, streaming hair, a pierced hand, and the half-nude breast of a woman. It was Éponine. The corner of the houses hid them from the insurgents. The corpses carried away from the barricade formed a terrible pile a few paces distant. Javert gazed askance at this body, and profoundly calm, said in a low tone, "It strikes me that I know that girl." Then he turned to Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean thrust the pistol under his arm and fixed on Javert a look which it required no words to interpret. "Javert, it is I." Javert replied, "Take your revenge." Jean Valjean drew from his pocket a knife and opened it. "A clasp knife!" exclaimed Javert. "You are right, that suits you better." Jean Valjean cut the martingale which Javert had about his neck. Then he cut the cords on his wrists. Then, stooping down, he cut the cord on his feet, and straightening himself up, he said to him, "You are free." Javert was not easily astonished. Still master of himself though he was, he could not repress a start. He remained open-mouthed and motionless. Jean Valjean continued, "I do not think that I shall escape from this place, but if by chance I do, I live under the name of Fauchelevent in the Rue de l'Homme Arme, No. 7. Javert snarled like a tiger, which made him half open one corner of his mouth, and he muttered between his teeth, "Have a care." "Go," said Jean Valjean. Javert began again. "Thou saidst Fauchelevent, Rue de l'Homme Arme, No. 7. Javert repeated in a low voice, "No. 7. He buttoned up his coat once more, resumed the military stiffness between his shoulders, made a half-turn, folded his arms, and supporting his chin on one of his hands, he set out in the direction of the Halles. Jean Valjean followed him with his eyes. A few minutes later, Javert turned round and shouted to Jean Valjean, "You annoy me. Kill me, rather." Javert himself did not notice that he no longer addressed Jean Valjean as thou. "Be off with you," said Jean Valjean. Javert retreated slowly. A moment later he turned the corner of the Rue des Prêcheurs. When Javert had disappeared, Jean Valjean fired his pistol in the air. Then he returned to the barricade and said, "It is done." In the meanwhile, this is what had taken place. Marius, more intent on the outside than on the interior, had not, up to that time, taken a good look at the pinioned spy in the dark background of the tap-room. When he beheld him in broad daylight striding over the barricade in order to proceed to his death, he recognized him. Something suddenly recurred to his mind. He recalled the inspector of the Rue des Pontois, the two pistols which the latter had handed to him, and which he, Marius, had used in this very barricade, and not only did he recall his face, but his name as well. This recollection was misty and troubled, however, like all his ideas. It was not an affirmation that he made, but a question which he put to himself. Is not that the inspector of police who told me that his name was Javert? Perhaps there was still time to intervene in behalf of that man, but in the first place he must know whether this was Javert. Marius called to Enjolras, who had just stationed himself at the other extremity of the barricade. "Enjolras!" "What?" "What is the name of yonder man?" "What man?" "The police agent. Do you know his name?" "Of course, he told us." "What is it?" "Javert." Marius sprang to his feet. At that moment they heard the report of the pistol. Jean Valjean reappeared and cried, "It is done." A gloomy chill traversed Marius's heart. End of Book 1, Chapters 17 to 19. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 20. The dead are in the right, and the living are not in the wrong. The death agony of the barricade was about to begin. Everything contributed to its tragic majesty at that supreme moment. 1,000 mysterious crashes in the air, the breath of armed masses set in movement in the streets which were not visible, the intermittent gallop of cavalry, the heavy shock of artillery on the march, the firing by squads, and the cannonades crossing each other in the labyrinth of Paris, the smokes of battle mounting all gilded above the roofs, indescribable and vaguely terrible cries, lightnings of menace everywhere, the tocsin of St. Mary, which had now the accents of a sob, the mildness of the weather, the splendour of the sky filled with sun and clouds, the beauty of the day, and the alarming silence of the houses. For, since the preceding evening, the 2 rows of houses in the Rue de la Chanvrerie had become 2 walls, ferocious walls, doors closed, windows closed, shutters closed. In those days, so different from those in which we live, when the hour was come, when the people wished to put an end to a situation which had lasted too long, with a charter granted or with a legal country, when universal wrath was diffused in the atmosphere, when the city consented to the tearing up of the pavements, when insurrection made the bourgeoisie smile by whispering its password in its ear, then the inhabitant, thoroughly penetrated with the revolt, so to speak, was the auxiliary of the combatant, and the house fraternized with the improvised fortress which rested on it. When the situation was not ripe, when the insurrection was not decidedly admitted, when the masses disowned the movement, all was over with the combatants. The city was changed into a desert around the revolt. Souls grew chilled, refuges were nailed up, and the street turned into a defile to help the army to take the barricade. A people cannot be forced, through surprise, to walk more quickly than it chooses. Woe to whomsoever tries to force its hand. A people does not let itself go at random. Then it abandons the insurrection to itself. The insurgents become noxious, infected with the plague. A house is an escarpment, a door is a refusal, a facade is a wall. This wall hears, sees, and will not. It might open and save you. No, this wall is a judge. It gazes at you and condemns you. What dismal things are closed houses! They seem dead, they are living. Life which is, as it were, suspended there, persists there. No one has gone out of them for 24 hours, but no one is missing from them. In the interior of that rock, people go and come, go to bed and rise again. They are a family party there. There they eat and drink. They are afraid, a terrible thing. Fear excuses this fearful lack of hospitality. Terror is mixed with it, an extenuating circumstance. Sometimes even, and this has been actually seen, fear turns to passion. Fright may change into fury as prudence does into rage. Hence this wise saying, the enraged moderates. There are outbursts of supreme terror, whence springs wrath like a mournful smoke. What do these people want? What have they come there to do? Let them get out of the scrape. So much the worse for them. It is their fault. They are only getting what they deserve. It does not concern us. Here is our poor street all riddled with balls. They are a pack of rascals. Above all things, don't open the door. And the house assumes the air of a tomb. The insurgent is in the death throes in front of that house. He sees the grape shot and naked swords drawing near. If he cries, he knows that they are listening to him, and that no one will come. There stand walls which might protect him. There are men who might save him, and these walls have ears of flesh, and these men have bowels of stone. Whom shall he reproach? No one, and everyone. The incomplete times in which we live. It is always at its own risk and peril that utopia is converted into revolution, and from philosophical protest becomes an armed protest, and from Minerva turns to Pallas. The utopia which grows impatient and becomes revolt knows what awaits it. It almost always comes too soon. Then it becomes resigned and stoically accepts catastrophe in lieu of triumph. It serves those who deny it without complaint, even excusing them, and even disculpates them, and its magnanimity consists in consenting to abandonment. It is indomitable in the face of obstacles and gentle towards ingratitude. Is this ingratitude, however? Yes, from the point of the human race. No, from the point of view of the individual. Progress is man's mode of existence. The general life of the human race is called progress. The collective stride of the human race is called progress. Progress advances. It makes the great human and terrestrial journey towards the celestial and the divine. It has its halting places where it rallies the laggard troop. It has its station where it mediates in the presence of some splendid Canaan suddenly unveiled on its horizon. It has its nights when it sleeps, and it is one of the poignant anxieties of the thinker that he sees the shadow resting on the human soul, and that he gropes in darkness without being able to awaken that slumbering progress. God is dead, perhaps, said Gerard de Nerval one day to the writer of these lines, confounding progress with God, and taking the interruption of movement for the death of being. He who despairs is in the wrong. Progress infallibly awakes, and in short, we may say that it marches on even when it is asleep, for it has increased in size. When we behold it erect once more, we find it taller. To be always peaceful does not depend on progress any more than it does on the stream. Erect no barriers, cast in no boulders. Obstacles make water froth and humanity boil. Hence arise troubles. But after these troubles we recognize the fact that ground has been gained. Until order, which is nothing else than universal peace, has been established, until harmony and unity reign, progress will have revolutions as its halting places. What, then, is progress? We have just enunciated it, the permanent life of the peoples. Now it sometimes happens that the momentary life of individuals offers resistance to the eternal life of the human race. Let us admit without bitterness that the individual has his distinct interests and can, without forfeiture, stipulate for his interest and defend it. The present has its pardonable dose of egotism. Momentary life has its rights, and is not bound to sacrifice itself constantly to the future. The generation which is passing in its turn over the earth is not forced to abridge it for the sake of the generations, its equal, after all, who will have their turn later on. I exist, murmurs that someone whose name is All. I am young and in love. I am old and I wish to repose. I am the father of a family. I toil. I prosper. I am successful in business. I have houses to lease. I have money in the government funds. I am happy. I have a wife and children. I have all this. I desire to live. Leave me in peace. Hence, at certain hours, profound cold broods over the magnanimous vanguard of the human race. Utopia, moreover, we must admit, quits its radiant sphere when it makes war. It, the truth of tomorrow, borrows its mode of procedure, battle, from the lie of yesterday. It, the future, behaves like the past. It, pure idea, becomes a deed of violence. It complicates its heroism with a violence for which it is just that it should be held in answer, a violence of occasion and expedient, contrary to principle, and for which it is fatally punished. The utopia, insurrection, fights with the old military code in its fist. It shoots spies, it executes traitors, it suppresses living beings and flings them into unknown darkness. It makes use of death, a serious matter. It seems as though Utopia had no longer any faith in radiance, its irresistible and incorruptible force. It strikes with the sword. Now, no sword is simple. Every blade has two edges. He who wounds with the one is wounded with the other. Having made this reservation and made it with all severity, it is impossible for us not to admire whether they succeed or not, those the glorious combatants of the future, the confessors of Utopia. Even when they miscarry, they are worthy of veneration, and it is perhaps in failure that they possess the most majesty. Victory, when it is in accord with progress, merits the applause of the people, but a heroic defeat merits their tender compassion. The one is magnificent, the other sublime. For our own part, we prefer martyrdom to success. John Brown is greater than Washington, and Pisacane is greater than Garibaldi. It certainly is necessary that someone should take the part of the vanquished. We are unjust towards these men who attempt the future when they fail. Revolutionists are accused of sowing fear abroad. Every barricade seems a crime. Their theories are incriminated, their aim suspected, their ulterior motive is feared, their conscience denounced. They are reproached with raising, erecting, and heaping up against the reigning social state a mass of miseries, of griefs, of iniquities, of wrongs, of despairs, and of tearing from the lowest depths blocks of shadow in order therein to embattle themselves and to combat. People shout to them, "You are tearing up the pavements of hell." They might reply, "That is because our barricade is made of good intentions." The best thing assuredly is the pacific solution. In short, let us agree that when we behold the pavement, we think of the bear, and it is a good will which renders society uneasy. But it depends on society to save itself. It is to its own good will that we make our appeal. No violent remedy is necessary. To study evil amiably, to prove its existence, then to cure it. It is to this that we invite it. However that may be, even when fallen, above all when fallen, these men, who at every point of the universe, with their eyes fixed on France, are striving for the grand work with the inflexible logic of the ideal, are august. They give their life a free offering to progress. They accomplish the will of Providence. They perform a religious act. At the appointed hour, with as much disinterestedness as an actor who answers to his cue, in obedience to the divine stage manager, they enter the tomb. And this hopeless combat, this stoical disappearance, they accept in order to bring about the supreme and universal consequences, the magnificent and irresistibly human movement begun on the 14th of July, 1789. These soldiers are priests. The French Revolution is an act of God. Moreover, there are, and it is proper to add this distinction to the distinctions already pointed out in another chapter, there are accepted revolutions, revolutions which are called revolutions. There are refused revolutions, which are called riots. An insurrection which breaks out is an idea which is passing its examination before the people. If the people lets fall a black ball, the idea is dried fruit. The insurrection is a mere skirmish. Waging war at every summons and every time that Utopia desires it is not the thing for the peoples. Nations have not always and at every hour the temperament of heroes and martyrs. They are positive. A priori, insurrection is repugnant to them in the first place, because it often results in a catastrophe, in the second place, because it always has an abstraction as its point of departure. Because, and this is a noble thing, it is always for the ideal, and for the ideal alone, that those who sacrifice themselves do thus sacrifice themselves. An insurrection is an enthusiasm. Enthusiasm may wax wroth, hence the appeal to arms. But every insurrection which aims at a government or a regime aims higher. Thus, for instance, and we insist upon it, what the chiefs of the insurrection of 1832, and in particular the young enthusiasts of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, were combating, was not precisely Louis Philippe. The majority of them, when talking freely, did justice to this king who stood midway between monarchy and revolution. No one hated him. But they attacked the younger branch of the divine right of Louis Philippe, as they had attacked its elder branch in Charles X. And that which they wished to overturn in overturning royalty in France was, as we have explained, the usurpation of man over man, and of privilege over right in the entire universe. Paris without a king has, as a result, the world without despots. This is the manner in which they are reasoned. Their aim was distant, no doubt, vague, perhaps. and it retreated in the face of their efforts. But it was great. Thus it is. And we sacrifice ourselves for these visions, which are almost always illusions for the sacrificed, but illusions with which, after all, the whole of human certainty is mingled. We throw ourselves into these tragic affairs and become intoxicated with that which we are about to do. Who knows? We may succeed. We are few in number. We have a whole army arrayed against us. But we are defending right, the natural law, the sovereignty of each one over himself from which no abdication is possible, justice and truth, and in case of need we die like the 300 Spartans. We do not think of Don Quixote, but of Leonidas. And we march straight before us, and once pledged we do not draw back, and we rush onwards with head held low, cherishing as our hope an unprecedented victory, revolution completed, progress set free again, the aggrandizement of the human race, universal deliverance, and in the event of the worst, Thermopylae. These passages of arms for the sake of progress often suffer shipwreck, and we have just explained why. The crowd is restive in the presence of the impulses of paladins. Heavy masses, the multitudes which are fragile because of their very weight, fear adventures, and there is a touch of adventure in the ideal. Moreover, and we must not forget this, interests which are not very friendly to the ideal and the sentimental are in the way. Sometimes the stomach paralyzes the heart. The grandeur and beauty of France lies in this, that she takes less from the stomach than other nations. She more easily knots the rope about her loins. She is the first awake, the last asleep. She marches forwards. She is a seeker. This arises from the fact that she is an artist. The ideal is nothing but the culminating point of logic, the same as the beautiful is nothing but the summit of the true. Artistic peoples are also consistent peoples. To love beauty is to see the light. That is why the torch of Europe, that is to say of civilization, was first borne by Greece, who passed it on to Italy, who handed it on to France. Divine, illuminating nations of scouts, vitae lampada tradunt. It is an admirable thing that the poetry of a people is the element of its progress. The amount of civilization is measured by the quantity of imagination. Only, a civilizing people should retain a manly people. Corinth, yes. Sybaris, no. Whoever becomes effeminate makes himself a bastard. He must be neither a dilettante nor a virtuoso, but he must be artistic. In the matter of civilization he must not refine, but he must sublime. On this condition one gives to the human race the pattern of the ideal. The modern ideal has its type in art, and its means in science. It is through science that it will realize that august vision of the poets, the socially beautiful. Eden will be reconstructed by A plus B. At the point which civilization has now reached, the exact is a necessary element of the splendid, and the artistic sentiment is not only served, but completed by the scientific organ. Dreams must be calculated. Art, which is the conqueror, should have for support science, which is the walker. The solidity of the creature which is ridden is of importance. The modern spirit is the genius of Greece, with the genius of India as its vehicle. Alexander on the elephant. Races which are petrified in dogma or demoralized by lucre are unfit to guide civilization. Genuflection before the idol or before money wastes away the muscles which walk in the will which advances. Hieratic or mercantile absorption lessens a people's power of radiance, lowers its horizon by lowering its level, and deprives it of that intelligence, at once both human and divine, of the universal goal, which makes missionaries of nations. Babylon has no ideal. Carthage has no ideal. Athens and Rome have and keep, throughout all the nocturnal darkness of the centuries, halos of civilization. France is in the same quality of race as Greece and Italy. She is Athenian in the matter of beauty, and Roman in her greatness. Moreover, she is good. She gives herself. Oftener than is the case with other races, is she in the humour for self-devotion and sacrifice. Only this humour seizes upon her and again abandons her. And therein lies the great peril for those who run when she desires only to walk, or who walk when she desires to halt. France has her relapses into materialism, and at certain instants the ideas which obstruct that sublime brain have no longer anything which recalls French greatness and are of the dimensions of a Missouri or a South Carolina. What is to be done in such a case? The giantess plays at being a dwarf. Immense France has her freaks of pettiness. That is all. To this there is nothing to say. Peoples, like planets, possess the right to an eclipse. And all is well, provided that the light returns and that the eclipse does not degenerate into night. Dawn and resurrection are synonyms. The reappearance of the light is identical with the persistence of the eye. Let us state these facts calmly. Death on the barricade or the tomb in exile is an acceptable occasion for devotion. The real name of devotion is disinterestedness. Let the abandoned allow themselves to be abandoned. Let the exiled allow themselves to be exiled. And let us confine ourselves to entreating great nations not to retreat too far when they do retreat. One must not push too far in descent under pretext of a return to reason. Matter exists. The minute exists. Interest exists. The stomach exists. But the stomach must not be the sole wisdom. The life of the moment has its rights, we admit, but permanent life has its rights also. Alas, the fact that one is mounted does not preclude a fall. This can be seen in history more frequently than is desirable. A nation is great, it tastes the ideal, then it bites the mire, and finds it good. And if it be asked how it happens that it has abandoned Socrates for Falstaff, it replies, "Because I love statesmen." One word more before returning to our subject, the conflict. A battle like the one which we are engaged in describing is nothing else than the convulsion towards the ideal. Progress trammelled is sickly, and is subject to these tragic ellipses. With that malady of progress, civil war, we have been obliged to come in contact in our passage. This is one of the fatal phases, at once act and entr'act of that drama whose pivot is a social condemnation, and whose veritable title is progress. Progress. The cry to which we frequently give utterance is our whole thought, and at the point of this drama which we have now reached, the idea which it contains having still more than one trial to undergo, it is, perhaps, permitted to us, if not to lift the veil from it, to at least allow its light to shine through. The book which the reader has under his eye at this moment is, from one end to the other, as a whole and in detail, whatever may be its intermittencies, exceptions and faults, the march from evil to good, from the unjust to the just, from night to day, from appetite to conscience, from rottenness to life, from hell to heaven, from nothingness to God. Point of departure, matter. Point of arrival, the soul. The hydra at the beginning, the angel at the end. End of Book 1, Chapter 20.
Book 1, The War Between Four Walls, Chapter 21, The Heroes. All at once the drum beat the charge. The attack was a hurricane. On the evening before, in the darkness, the barricade had been approached silently as by a boa. Now, in broad daylight, in that widening street, surprise was decidedly impossible. Rude force had, moreover, been unmasked, and the cannon had begun the roar. The army hurled itself on the barricade. Fury now became skill. A powerful detachment of infantry of the line, broken at regular intervals by the National Guard and the Municipal Guard on foot, and supported by serried masses which could be heard though not seen, debouched into the street at a run. With drums beating, trumpets braying, bayonets levelled, the sappers at their head, and imperturbable under the projectiles, charged straight for the barricade with the weight of a brazen beam against a wall. The wall held firm. The insurgents fired impetuously. The barricade, once scaled, had a mane of lightning flashes. The assault was so furious that for one moment it was inundated with assailants. but it shook off the soldiers as a lion shakes off the dogs, and it was only covered with besiegers as the cliff is covered with foam, to reappear a moment later, beetling, black and formidable. The column, forced to retreat, remained massed in the street, unprotected but terrible, and replied to the redoubt with a terrible discharge of musketry. Any one who has seen fireworks will recall the sheaf formed of interlacing lightning, which is called a bouquet. Let the reader picture to himself this bouquet, no longer vertical but horizontal, bearing a bullet, buckshot, or biscaine at the tip of each one of its jets of flames, and picking off dead men one or another from its clusters of lightning. The barricade was underneath it. On both sides the resolution was equal. The bravery exhibited there was almost barbarous, and was complicated with a sort of heroic ferocity which began by the sacrifice of self. This was the epoch when a National Guardman fought like the Zouave. The troop wished to make an end of it. Insurrection was desirous of fighting. The acceptance of the death agony in the flower of youth and in the flush of health turns intrepidity into frenzy. In this fray each one underwent the broadening growth of the death hour. The street was strewn with corpses. The barricade had Enjolras as one of its extremities and Marius at the other. Enjolras, who carried the whole barricade in his head, reserved and sheltered himself. 3 soldiers fell, one after the other, under his embrasure, without having even seen him. Marius fought unprotected. He made himself a target. He stood with more than half his body above the breastworks. There is no more violent prodigal than the avaricious man who takes the bit in his teeth. There is no more man more terrible in action than a dreamer. Marius was formidable and pensive. In battle he was as in a dream. One would have pronounced him a phantom engaged in firing a gun. The insurgents' cartridges were giving out, but not their sarcasm. In this whirlwind of the sepulchre in which they stood, they laughed. Courfeyrac was bareheaded. "What have you done with your hat?" Bossuet asked him. Courfeyrac replied, "They have taken it away from me with the cannon balls." Or they uttered haughty comments. "Can anyone understand," exclaimed Fréry bitterly, "those men," and he cited names, well-known names, even celebrated names, some belonging to the old army, who had promised to join us, and taken an oath to aid us, and had pledged their honor to it, and who are our generals, and who abandoned us? And Combeferre restricted himself to replying with a grave smile, "There are people who observe the rules of honor, as one observed the stars from a great distance." The interior of the barricade was so strewn with torn cartridges that one would have said there had been a snowstorm. The assailants had numbers in their favor, the insurgents had position. They were at the top of the wall. They thundered point blank upon the soldiers tripping over the dead and wounded and entangled in the escarpment. This barricade, constructed as it was, and admirably buttressed, was really one of those situations where a handful of men hold a legion in check. Nevertheless, the attacking column, constantly recruited and enlarged under the shower of bullets, drew inexorably clearer, and now, little by little, step by step, but surely, the army closed in around the barricade as the vice grasped the wine-press. One assault followed another. The horror of the situation kept increasing. Then there burst forth on that heap of paving stones, in that Rue de la Chanvrerie, the battle worthy of the wall of Troy. These haggard, ragged, exhausted men, who had nothing to eat for 24 hours, who had not slept, who had but a few more rounds to fire, who were fumbling in their pockets which had been emptied of cartridges, nearly all of whom were wounded, with head or arm bandaged with black and blood-stained linen, with holes in their clothes from which the blood trickled, and who were hardly armed with poor guns and notched swords, became Titans. The barricade was 10 times attacked, approached, assailed, scaled, and never captured. In order to form an idea of this struggle, it is necessary to imagine fire set to a throng of terrible courages, and then to gaze at the conflagration. It was not a combat. It was the interior of a furnace. Their mouths breathed the flame. Their countenances were extraordinary. The human form seemed impossible there. The combatants flamed forth there, and it was formidable to behold the going and the comings in that red glow of those salamanders of the fray. The successive and the simultaneous scenes of this grand slaughter we renounce all attempts at depicting. The epic alone has the right to fill 12,000 verses with a battle. One would have pronounced this that hell of Brahmanism, the most redoubtable of the 17 abysses, which the Veda calls the forest of the swords. They fought hand to hand, foot to foot, with pistol shots, with blows of the sword, with their fists, at a distance, close at hand, from above, from below, from everywhere, from the roofs of the houses, from the windows of the wine shops, from the cellar windows, whither some had crawled. They were 1 against 60. The facade of the Corinth, half demolished, was hideous. The window, tattooed with grape shot, had lost glass and frame and was nothing now but a shapeless hole, tumultuously blocked with paving stones. Bossuet was killed, Feuilly was killed, Courfeyrac was killed. Combeferre, transfixed by 3 blows from a bayonet in the breast at the moment when he was lifting up a wounded soldier, had only time to glance to heaven when he expired. Marius, still fighting, was so riddled with wounds, particularly in the head, that his countenance disappeared beneath the blood, and one would have said that his face was covered with a red handkerchief. Enjolras alone was not struck. When he no longer had any weapon, he reached out his hands to the right and left, and an insurgent thrust some arm or other into his fist. All he had left was the stumps of 4 swords, one more than Francois at Marion. Homer says, Diomedes cuts the throat of Axylus, son of Teuthranus, who dwelt in happy Arisba. Euryalus, son of Mecisteus, exterminates Drasos and Opheltios, Escipius, and that Pedaeus, whom the Naiad of Barbarea, born to the blameless Bucolion. Ulysses overthrows Pedaetes of the Percosius. Antilochus, Ablerus, Polypades, Astellus, Polydamas, Otoes of Cyllene, and Teucer of Rhetion. Meganthios dies under the blows of Eurypylus' pike. Agamemnon, king of the heroes, flings to earth Elatos, born in the rocky city which is laved by the surrounding river Santnois. In our old poems of exploits, Aplandian attacks of the giant Marcos Swantibor with a cobbler's shoulder stick of fire, and the latter defends himself by stoning the hero which towers he plucks up by the roots. Our ancient mural frescoes shows us the 2 dukes of Bretagne and Bourbon, armed, emblazoned, and crested in warlike guise, on horseback and approaching each other, their battle axes in hand, masked with iron, gloved with iron, booted with iron, one caparisoned in ermine, the other draped in azure, Bretagne with his lion between 2 horns of his crown, Bourbon helmeted in a monster fleur-de-lis on his visor. But in order to be superb, it is not necessary to wear like Yevon, the Duke of Moirion, to have in the fist like Esplandian a living flame, or like Phyles, father of Polydamas, to have brought back from Ephyra a good suit of mail, a present from the king of men, Euphides. It suffices to give one's life for conviction or loyalty. This ingenious little soldier, yesterday a peasant of Beausset or Limousin, who prowls with a clasp knife by his side around the children's nurses in the Luxembourg garden, this pale young student bent over a piece of anatomy or a book, a blond youth who shaves his beard with scissors, take both of them, breathe upon them with a breath of duty, place them face to face in the Coiffeur Boncheret or in the blind alley Planchet Meublé, and let one fight for his flag or the other for his ideal, and let both of them imagine that they are fighting for their country, the struggle will be colossal. and the shadow which this raw recruit and this sawbones in conflict will produce in that grand epic field where the human is striving will equal the shadow cast by Megaryon, king of Lycia, tiger-filled, crushing in his embrace the immense body of Ajax equal to the gods. End of Book 1, Chapter 21. Book 1, The War Between Four Walls, Chapter 22, Foot to Foot. When there were no longer any of the leaders left alive except Enjolras and Marius at the two extremities of the barricade, the centre, which had so long sustained Courfeyrac, Joly, Bossuet, Feuillet, and Combeferre, gave way. The cannon, though it had not effected a practical breach, had made a rather large hollow in the middle of the redoubt. There, the summit of the wall had disappeared before the balls, and had crumbled away, and the rubbish which had fallen, now inside, now outside, had, as it accumulated, formed two piles in the nature of slopes on the two sides of the barrier, one on the inside, the other on the outside. The exterior slope presented an inclined plane to the attack. A final assault was there attempted, and this assault succeeded. The mass, bristling with bayonets and hurled forward at a run, came up with irresistible force, and the serried front of battle of the attacking column made its appearance through the smoke on the crest of the battlements. This time it was decisive. The group of insurgents who were defending the centre retreated in confusion. Then the gloomy love of life awoke once more in some of them. Many, finding themselves under the muzzle of this forest of guns, did not wish to die. This is the moment when the instinct of self-preservation emits howls, when the beast reappears in men. They were hemmed in by the lofty six-story house which formed the background of their redoubt. This house might prove to be their salvation. The building was barricaded and walled, as it were, from top to bottom. Before the troops of the line had reached the interior of the redoubt, there was time for a door to open and shut. The space of the flash of a lightning was sufficient for that, and the door of that house, suddenly opened a crack and closed again instantly, was life for these despairing men. Behind this house there were streets, possible flight space. They set to knocking at that door with the butts of their gun, and with kicks, shouting, calling, entreating, wringing their hands. No one opened. From the little window on the third floor, the head of a dead man gazed down upon them. But Enjolras and Marius and the 7 or 8 rallied about them, sprang forward and protected them. Enjolras had shouted to the soldiers, "Don't advance!" and as an officer had not obeyed, Enjolras had killed the officer. He was now in the little inner court of the redoubt, with his back planted against the Corinthe building, a sword in one hand, a rifle in the other, holding open the door of the wine shop which he barred against assailants. He shouted to the desperate men, "There is but one open door, this one," and shielding him with his body, and facing an entire battalion alone, he made them pass in behind him. All precipitated themselves thither. Enjolras, executing with his rifle, which he now used like a cane, what single-stick players called a covered rose round his head, levelled the bayonets around and in front of him, and was the last to enter. And then ensued a horrible moment, when the soldiers tried to make their way in, and the insurgents strove to bar them out. The door was slammed with such violence that, as it fell back into his frame, it showed the 5 fingers of a soldier who had been clinging to it, cut off and glued to the post. Marius remained outside. A shot had just broken his collarbone. He felt that he was fainting and falling. At that moment, with eyes already shut, he felt the shock of a vigorous hand seizing him, and the swoon in which his senses vanished, hardly allowing him time for the thought, mingled with the last memory of Cosette, "I am taken prisoner. I shall be shot." Enjolras, not seeing Marius among those who had taken refuge in the wine shop, had the same idea. But they had reached a moment when each man has not the time to meditate on his own death. Enjolras fixed the bar across the door and bolted it, and double-locked it with key and chain, while those outside were battering furiously at it, the soldiers with the butts of their muskets, the sappers with their axes. The assailants were grouped about that door. The siege of the wine shop was now beginning. The soldiers, we will observe, were full of wrath. The death of the artillery sergeant had enraged them, And then a still more melancholy circumstance. During the few hours which had preceded the attack, it had been reported among them that the insurgents were mutilating their prisoners, and that there was a headless body of a soldier in the wine shop. This sort of fatal rumour is usually accompaniment of civil wars, and it was a false report of this kind which, later on, produced the catastrophe of Rue Transnonain. When the door was barricaded, Enjolras said to the others, "Let us sell our lives dearly." Then he approached the table on which lay Mabeuf and Gavroche. Beneath the black cloth, two straight and rigid forms were visible, one large and the other small, and the two faces were vaguely outlined beneath the cold folds of the shroud. A hand projected from beneath the winding sheet and hung near the floor. It was that of the old man. Enjolras bent down and kissed that venerable hand, just as he had kissed his brow on the preceding evening. These were the only two kisses which he had bestowed in the course of his life. Let us abridge the tale. The barricade had fought like the gate of Thebes. The wine shop fought like a house of Saragossa. These resistances are dogged. No quarter, no flag of truce possible. Men are willing to die, provided their opponent will kill them. When Suchet says, "Capitulate," Palafox replies, "After the war with cannon, the war with knives." Nothing was lacking in the capture by assault of the Hachoulette wine shop. Neither paving stones raining from the windows and the roof on the besiegers and exasperating the soldiers by crushing them horribly, nor shots fired from the attic windows and the cellar, nor the fury of the attack, nor finally, when the door yielded, the frenzied madness of extermination. The assailants, rushing into the wine shop, their feet entangled in the panels of the door which had been beaten in and flung on the ground, found not a single combatant there. The spiral staircase, hewn asunder with the axe, lay in the middle of the tap-room. A few wounded men were just breathing their last. Everyone who was not killed on the first floor, and from there, through the hole in the ceiling, which had formed the entrance of the stairs, a terrific fire burst forth. This was the last of their cartridges. When they were exhausted, when these formidable men on the point of death had no longer either powder or ball, each grasped in his hands two of the bottles which Enjolras had reserved, and of which we had spoken, and held the scaling party in check with these frightfully fragile clubs. They were the bottle of aquafortis. We relate these gloomy incidents of carnage as they occurred. The besieged man, alas, converts everything into a weapon. Greek fire did not disgrace Archimedes. Boiling pitch did not disgrace Bayard. All war is a thing of terror, and there is no choice in it. The musketry of the besiegers, though confined and embarrassed by being directed from below upwards, was deadly. The rim of the hole in the ceiling was speedily surrounded by heads of the slain, whence dripping long, red and smoking streams. The uproar was indescribable. A close and burning smoke almost produced night over this combat. Words are lacking to express horror when it has reached this pitch. There were no longer men in this conflict, which was now infernal. They are no longer giants mashed with the colossi. It resembled Milton and Dante rather than Homer. Demons attacked, spectres resisted. It was heroism become monstrous. End of Book 1, Chapter 22.
Book 1, The War Between Four Walls. Chapter 23. Orestes fasting, and Pylades drunk. At length, by dint of mounting on each other's backs, aiding themselves with the skeleton of the staircase, climbing up the walls, clinging to the ceiling, slashing away at the very brink of the trap-door, the last one who offered resistance, a score of assailants, soldiers, National Guardsmen, municipal guardsmen, in utter confusion, the majority disfigured by wounds in the face during that redoubtable ascent, blinded by blood, furious, rendered savage, made an irruption into the apartment on the first floor. There they found only one man still on his feet, Enjolras. Without cartridges, without sword, he had nothing in his hand now but the barrel of his gun, whose stock he had broken over the head of those who were entering. He had placed the billiard table between his assailants and himself. He had retreated into the corner of the room, and there, with haughty eye and head borne high, With the stump of a weapon in his hand, he was still so alarming as to speedily create an empty space around him. A cry arose. "He is the leader! It was he who slew the artilleryman! It is well that he has placed himself there. Let him remain there. Let us shoot him down on the spot." "Shoot me," said Enjolras. And flinging away his bit of gun-barrel and folding his arms, he offered his breast. The audacity of a fine death always affects men. As soon as Enjolras folded his arms and accepted his end, the din of strife ceased in the room, and this chaos suddenly stilled into a sort of sepulchral solemnity. The menacing majesty of Enjolras, disarmed and motionless, appeared to oppress this tumult, and this young man, haughty, bloody, and charming, who alone had not a wound, who was as indifferent as an invulnerable being, seemed, by the authority of his tranquil glance, to constrain this sinister rabble to kill him respectfully. His beauty at that moment, augmented by his pride, was resplendent, and he was fresh and rosy after the fearful 24 hours which had just elapsed, as though he could no more be fatigued than wounded. It was of him, possibly, that a witness spoke afterwards before the council of war. "There was an insurgent whom I heard called Apollo." A National Guardsman who had taken aim at Enjolras lowered his gun, saying, "It seems to me that I am about to shoot a flower." 12 men formed into a squad in the corner opposite Enjolras, and silently made ready their guns. Then a sergeant shouted, "Take aim!" An officer intervened. "Wait." And addressing Enjolras, "Do you wish to have your eyes bandaged?" "No." "Was it you who killed the artillery sergeant?" "Yes." Grantaire had waked up a few moments before. Grantaire, it will be remembered, had been asleep ever since the preceding evening in the upper room of the wine shop, seated on a chair and leaning on the table. He realized, in its fullest sense, the old metaphor of dead drunk. The hideous potion of absinthe, porter, and alcohol had thrown him into a lethargy. His table being small and not suitable for the barricade, he had been left in possession of it. He was still in the same posture, with his breast bent over the table, his head lying flat on his arms, surrounded by glasses, beer jugs, and bottles. His was the overwhelming slumber of the torpid bear and the satiated leech. Nothing had had any effect upon it, neither the fusillade, nor the cannon-balls, nor the grape-shot which had made its way through the window into the room where he was, nor the tremendous uproar of the assault. He merely replied to the cannonade now and then by a snore. He seemed to be waiting there for a bullet which should spare him the trouble of waking. Many corpses were strewn around him, and, at the first glance, there was nothing to distinguish him from those profound sleepers of death. Noise does not rouse a drunken man. Silence awakens him. The fall of everything around him only augmented Grantaire's prostration. The crumbling of all things was his lullaby. The sort of halt which the tumult underwent in the presence of Enjolras was a shock to this heavy slumber. It had the effect of a carriage going at full speed, which suddenly comes to a dead stop. The persons dozing within it wake up. Grantaire rose to his feet with a start, stretched out his arms, rubbed his eyes, stared, yawned, and understood. A fit of drunkenness, reaching its end, resembles a curtain which is torn away. One beholds at a single glance, and as a whole, all that it has concealed. All suddenly presents itself to the memory, and the drunkard who has known nothing of what has been taking place during the last 24 hours has no sooner opened his eyes than he is perfectly informed. Ideas recur to him with abrupt lucidity. The obliteration of intoxication, a sort of steam which has obscured the brain, is dissipated, and makes way for the clear and sharply outlined importunity of realities. Relegated as he was to one corner and sheltered behind the billiard table, The soldiers, whose eyes were fixed on Enjolras, had not even noticed Grantaire, and the sergeant was preparing to repeat his order, "Take aim," when all at once they heard a strong voice shout beside them, "Long live the Republic! I'm one of them." Grantaire had risen. The immense gleam of the whole combat, which he had missed, and in which he had had no part, appeared in the brilliant glance of this transfigured, drunken man. He repeated, "Long live the Republic!" crossed the room with a firm stride, and placed himself in front of the guns beside Enjolras. "Finish both of us at one blow," said he. And turning gently to Enjolras, he said to him, "Do you permit it?" Enjolras pressed his hand with a smile. The smile was not ended when the report resounded. Enjolras, pierced by 8 bullets, remained leaning against the wall as though the balls had nailed him there. Only his head was bowed. Grantaire fell at his feet as though struck by a thunderbolt. A few moments later, the soldiers dislodged the last remaining insurgents, who had taken refuge at the top of the house. They fired into the attic through a wooden lattice. They fought under the very roof. They flung bodies, some of them still alive, out through the windows. 2 light infantrymen, who tried to lift the shattered omnibus, were slain by 2 shots fired from the attic. A man in a blouse was flung down from it with a bayonet wound in the abdomen, and breathed his last on the ground. A soldier and an insurgent slipped together on the sloping slates of the roof, and, as they would not release each other, they fell, clasped in a ferocious embrace. A similar conflict went on in the cellar. Shouts, shots, a fierce trampling. Then silence. The barricade was captured. The soldiers began to search the house round about and to pursue the fugitives. Chapter 24. Prisoner. Marius was, in fact, a prisoner. The hand which had seized him from behind, and whose grasp he had felt at the moment of his fall and his loss of consciousness, was that of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean had taken no other part in the combat than to expose himself in it. Had it not been for him, no one, in that supreme phase of agony, would have thought of the wounded. Thanks to him, everywhere present in the carnage, like a providence, those who fell were picked up, transported to the tap-room, and cared for. In the intervals he reappeared on the barricade. But nothing which could resemble a blow, an attack, or even personal defense proceeded from his hands. He held his peace and lent succor. Moreover, he had received only a few scratches. The bullets would have none of him. If suicide formed part of what he had meditated on coming to the sepulchre, to that spot, he had not succeeded. But we doubt whether he had thought of suicide, an irreligious act. Jean Valjean, in the thick cloud of the combat, did not appear to see Marius. The truth is that he never took his eyes from the latter. When a shot laid Marius low, Jean Valjean leapt forward with the agility of a tiger, fell upon him as on his prey, and bore him off. The whirlwind of the attack was, at that moment, so violently concentrated upon Enjolras and upon the door of the wine-shop that no one saw Jean Valjean, sustaining the fainting Marius in his arms, traverse the unpaved field of the barricade and disappear behind the angle of the Corinthe building. The reader will recall this angle, which formed a sort of cape on the street. It afforded shelter from the bullets, the grape-shot, and all eyes, and a few square feet of space. There is sometimes a chamber which does not burn in the midst of a conflagration, and in the midst of raging seas, beyond a promontory, or at the extremity of a blind alley of shoals, a tranquil nook. It was in this sort of fold, in the interior trapezium of the barricade, that Éponine had breathed her last. There Jean Valjean halted, let Marius slide to the ground, placed his back against the wall, and cast his eyes about him. The situation was alarming. For an instant, for 2 or 3 perhaps, this bit of wall was a shelter, But how was he to escape from this massacre? He recalled the anguish which he had suffered in the Rue Polonceau 8 years before, and in what manner he had contrived to make his escape. It was difficult then, today it was impossible. He had before him that deaf and implacable house, 6 stories in height, which appeared to be inhabited only by a dead man leaning out of his window. He had on his right the rather low barricade, which shut off the Rue de la Petite Truanderie. To pass this obstacle seemed easy, but beyond the crest of the barrier a line of bayonets was visible. The troops of the line were posted on the watch behind the barricade. It was evident that to pass the barricade was to go in quest of the fire of the platoon, and that any head which should run the risk of lifting itself above the top of that wall of stones would serve as a target for 60 shots. On his left he had the field of battle. Death lurked round the corner of that wall. What was to be done? Only a bird could have extricated itself from this predicament. And it was necessary to decide on the instant, to devise some expedient, to come to some decision. Fighting was going on a few paces away. Fortunately, all were raging around a single point, the door of the wine-shop. But if it should occur to one soldier, to one single soldier, to turn the corner of the house, or to attack him on the flank, all was over. Jean Valjean gazed at the house facing him. He gazed at the barricade at one side of him. Then he looked at the ground, with the violence of the last extremity, bewildered, and as though he would have liked to pierce a hole there with his eyes. By dint of staring, something vaguely striking in such an agony began to assume form and outline at his feet, as though it had been a power of glance which made the thing desired unfold. A few paces distant he perceived, at the base of the small barrier so pitilessly guarded and watched on the exterior, beneath a disordered mass of paving stones which partly concealed it, an iron grating, placed flat and on a level with the soil. This grating, made of stout transverse bars, was about 2 feet square. The frame of paving stones which supported it had been torn up, and it was, as it were, unfastened. Through the bars, a view could be had of a dark aperture, something like the flue of a chimney or the pipe of a cistern. Jean Valjean darted forward. His old art of escape rose to his brain like an illumination. To thrust aside the stones, to raise the grating, to lift Marius, who was as inert as a dead body, upon his shoulders, to descend with this burden on his loins, and with the aid of his elbows and knees into that sort of well, fortunately not very deep, to let the heavy trap, upon which the loosened stones rolled down afresh, fall into its place behind him, to gain his footing on a flagged surface 3 meters below the surface. All this was executed like that which one does in dreams, with the strength of a giant and the rapidity of an eagle. This took only a few minutes. Jean Valjean found himself with Marius, who was still unconscious, in a sort of long subterranean corridor. There reigned profound peace, absolute silence, night. The impression which he had formerly experienced when falling from the wall into the convent recurred to him. Only what he was carrying today was not Cosette, it was Marius. He could barely hear the formidable tumult in the wine-shop, taken by assault, like a vague murmur overhead.
End of Book 1, Chapters 23 through 24.
Recording by Musical Heart 1.